11 minutes Coelho, Paulo Luke 7:37-47 For I am the first and the last, I am the venerated and the despised, I am the prostitute and the saint, I am the wife and the virgin, I am the mother and the daughter, I am the arms of my mother, I am barren and my children are many, I am the married woman and the spinster, I am the woman who gives birth and she who never procreated, I am the consolation for the pain of birth, I am the wife and the husband and it was my man who created me, I am the mother of my father, I am the sister of my husband and he is my rejected son, always respect me for I am the shameful and the magnificent one. Hymn to Isis, 3rd or 4th century BC, discovered in Nag Hammadi. Once upon a time, there was a prostitute called Maria. Wait a minute. Once upon a time is how all the best children's stories begin, and prostitute is a word for adults. How can I start a book with this apparent contradiction? But since, at every moment of our lives, we all have one foot in a fairy tale and the other in the abyss, let's keep that beginning. Once upon a time, there was a prostitute called Maria. Like all prostitutes, she was born both innocent and a virgin, and, as an adolescent, she dreamed of meeting the man of her life, rich, handsome, intelligent, of getting married, in a wedding dress, having 2 children, who would grow up to be famous, and living in a lovely house, with a sea view. Her father was a traveling salesman, her mother a seamstress, and her hometown, in the interior of Brazil, had only one cinema, one nightclub, and one bank, which was why Maria was always hoping that one day, without warning, her Prince Charming would arrive, sweep her off her feet and take her away with him so that they could conquer the world together. While she was waiting for her Prince Charming to appear, all she could do was dream. She fell in love for the first time when she was 11, en route from her house to school. On the first day of term, she discovered that she was not alone on her way to school. Making the same journey was a boy who lived in her neighborhood and who shared the same timetable. They never exchanged a single word, but gradually Maria became aware that, for her, the best part of the day were those moments spent going to school, moments of dust, thirst, and weariness, with the sun beating down, the boy walking fast, and with her trying her hardest to keep up. This scene was repeated month after month. Maria, who hated studying and whose only other distraction in life was television, began to wish that the days would pass quickly. She waited eagerly for each journey to school and, unlike other girls her age, she found the weekends deadly dull. Given that the hours pass more slowly for a child than for an adult, she suffered greatly and found the days far too long simply because they allowed her only 10 minutes to be with the love of her life and thousands of hours to spend thinking about him, imagining how good it would be if they could talk. Then it happened. One morning, on the way to school, the boy came up to her and asked if he could borrow a pencil. Maria didn't reply. In fact, she seemed rather irritated by this unexpected approach and even quickened her step. She had felt petrified when she saw him coming towards her, terrified that he might realize how much she loved him, how eagerly she had waited for him, how she had dreamed of taking his hand, of walking straight past the school gates with him and continuing along the road to the end, where, people said there was a big city, film stars, and television stars, cars, lots of cinemas, and an endless number of fun things to do. For the rest of the day, she couldn't concentrate on her lessons, tormented by her own absurd behavior, but, at the same time, relieved, because she knew that the boy had noticed her too, and that the pencil had just been an excuse to start a conversation, because when he came over to her, she had noticed that he already had a pen in his pocket. She waited for the next time, and during that night, and the nights that followed, she went over and over what she would say to him, until she found the right way to begin a story that would never end. But there was no next time, for although they continued to walk to school together, with Maria sometimes a few steps ahead, clutching a pencil in her right hand, and at other times, walking slightly behind him so that she could gaze at him tenderly, he never said another word to her, and she had to content herself with loving and suffering in silence until the end of the school year. During the interminable school holidays that followed, she woke up one morning to find that she had blood on her legs and was convinced she was going to die. She decided to leave a letter for the boy, telling him that he had been the great love of her life, and then she would go off into the bush and doubtless be killed by one of the two monsters that terrorized the country people round about, the werewolf and the mula semkabiga, said to be a priest's mistress transformed into a mule and doomed to wander the night. That way, her parents wouldn't suffer too much over her death, for, although constantly beset by tragedies, the poor are always hopeful, and her parents would persuade themselves that she had been kidnapped by a wealthy, childless family, but would return one day, rich and famous, while the current, and eternal, love of her life would never forget her, torturing himself each day for not having spoken to her again. She never did write that letter because her mother came into the room, saw the blood-stained sheets, smiled and said, "Now you're a young woman." Maria wondered what the connection was between the blood on her legs and her becoming a young woman, but her mother wasn't able to give her a satisfactory explanation. She just said that it was normal, and that, from now on, for 4 or 5 days a month, she would have to wear something like a doll's pillow between her legs. Maria asked if men used some kind of tube to stop the blood going all over their trousers, and was told that this was something that only happened to women. Maria complained to God, but, in the end, she got used to menstruating. She could not, however, get used to the boy's absence, and kept blaming herself for her own stupidity in running away from the very thing she most wanted. The day before the new term began, she went to the only church in town and vowed to the image of Saint Anthony that she would take the initiative and speak to the boy. The following day, she put on her smartest dress, one that her mother had made specially for the occasion, and set off to school, thanking God that the holidays had finally ended. But the boy did not appear. And so another agonizing week passed, until she found out, through some school friends, that he had left town. "He's gone somewhere far away," someone said. At that moment, Maria learned that certain dyings are lost forever. She learned too that there was a place called somewhere far away, that the world was vast and her own town very small, and that, in the end, the most interesting people always leave. She too would like to leave, but she was still very young. Nevertheless, looking at the dusty streets of the town where she lived, she decided that one day she would follow in the boy's footsteps. On the 9 Fridays that followed, she took communion, as was the custom in her religion, and asked the Virgin Mary to take her away from there. She grieved for a while too and tried vainly to find out where the boy had gone, but no one knew where his parents had moved to. It began to seem to Maria that the world was too large, that love was something very dangerous, and that the Virgin was a saint who inhabited a distant heaven and didn't listen to the prayers of children. 3 years passed, she learned geography and mathematics, she began following the soaps on TV, at school, she read her first erotic magazine, and she began writing a diary describing her humdrum life and her desire to experience firsthand the things they told her about in class: the ocean, snow, men in turbans, elegant women covered in jewels. But since no one can live on impossible dreams, especially when their mother is a seamstress and their father is hardly ever at home, she soon realized that she needed to take more notice of what was going on around her. She studied in order to get on in life, at the same time looking for someone with whom she could share her dreams of adventure. When she had just turned 15, she fell in love with a boy she had met in a Holy Week procession. She did not repeat her childhood mistake. They talked, became friends and started going to the cinema and to parties together. She also noticed that, as had happened with the first boy, she associated love more with the person's absence than with their presence. She would miss her boyfriend intensely, would spend hours imagining what they would talk about when next they met, and remembering every second they had spent together, trying to work out what she had done right and what she had done wrong. She liked to think of herself as an experienced young woman, who had already allowed one grand passion to slip from her grasp and who knew the pain that this caused. And now she was determined to fight with all her might for this man and for marriage, determined that he was the man for marriage, children, and the house by the sea. She went to talk to her mother, who said imploringly, "But you're still very young, my dear. You got married to my father when you were 16. Her mother preferred not to explain that this had been because of an unexpected pregnancy, and so she used the "things were different then" argument and brought the matter to a close. The following day, Maria and her boyfriend went for a walk in the countryside. They talked a little, and Maria asked if he wanted to travel, but, instead of answering the question, he took her in his arms and kissed her. Her first kiss. How she had dreamed of that moment. And the landscape was special too, the herons flying, the sunset, the wild beauty of that semi-arid region, the sound of distant music. Maria pretended to draw back, but then she embraced him and repeated what she had seen so often on the cinema, in magazines, and on TV. She rubbed her lips against his with some violence, moving her head from side to side, half rhythmic, half frenzied. Now and then, she felt the boy's tongue touch her teeth and thought it felt delicious. Then suddenly he stopped kissing her and asked, "Don't you want to?" What was she supposed to say? Did she want to? Of course she did. But a woman shouldn't expose herself in that way, especially not to her future husband, otherwise he would spend the rest of his life suspecting that she might say yes to not easily to anything. She decided not to answer. He kissed her again, this time with rather less enthusiasm. Again he stopped, red-faced, and Maria knew that something was very wrong, but she was afraid to ask what it was. She took his hand, and they walked back to the town together, talking about other dyings, as if nothing had happened. That night, using the occasional difficult word because she was sure that, one day, everything she had written would be read by someone else, and because she was convinced that something very important had happened, she wrote in her diary, "When we meet someone and fall in love, we have a sense that the whole universe is on our side. I saw this happen today as the sun went down. And yet if something goes wrong, there is nothing left. No herons, no distant music, not even the taste of his lips. How is it possible for the beauty that was there only minutes before to vanish so quickly? Life moves very fast. It rushes us from heaven to hell in a matter of seconds." The following day, she talked to her girlfriends. They had all seen her going out for a walk with her future betrothed. After all, it is not enough just to have a great love in your life, you must make sure that everyone know what a desirable person you are. They were dying to know what had happened, and Maria, very full of herself, said that the best bit was when his tongue touched her teeth. One of the other girls laughed. "Didn't you open your mouth?" Suddenly everything became clear, his question, his disappointment. What for? To let him put his tongue inside. What difference does it make? It's not something you can explain. That's just how people kiss. There was much giggling, pretend pity, and gleeful feelings of revenge amongst these girls who had never had a boy in love with them. Maria pretended not to care and she laughed too, although her soul was weeping. She secretly cursed the films she had seen in the cinema, from which she had learned to close her eyes, place her hand on the man's head and move her head slightly to right and left, but which had failed to show the essential, most important thing. She made up the perfect excuse, "I didn't want to give myself at once, because I wasn't sure, but now I realize that you are the love of my life," and waited for the next opportunity. She didn't see him until 3 days later, at a party in a local club, and he was holding the hand of a friend of hers, the one who had asked her about the kiss. She again pretended that she didn't care, and survived until the end of the evening talking with her girlfriends about film stars and about other local boys, and pretending not to notice her friends' occasional pitying looks. Then she arrived home, though, she allowed her universe to crumble, she cried all night, suffered for the next 8 months and concluded that love clearly wasn't made for her and that she wasn't made for love. She considered becoming a nun and devoting the rest of her life to a kind of love that didn't hurt and didn't leave painful scars on the heart, love for Jesus. At school, they learned missionaries who went to Africa, and she decided that there lay an escape from her dull existence. She planned to enter a convent. She learned first aid. According to some teachers, a lot of people were dying in Africa, worked harder in her religious knowledge classes, and began to imagine herself as a modern-day saint, saving lives, and visiting jungles inhabited by lions and tigers. However, her 15th year brought with it not only the discovery that you were supposed to kiss with your mouth open, and that love is, above all, a cause of suffering. She discovered a third thing: masturbation. It happened almost by chance, as she was touching her genitals while waiting for her mother to come home. She used to do this when she was a child and she liked the feeling, until, one day, her father saw her and slapped her hard, without explaining why. She never forgot being hit like that, and she learned that she shouldn't touch herself in front of other people, since she couldn't do it in the middle of the street and she didn't have a room of her own at home. She forgot all about the pleasurable sensation. Until that afternoon, almost 6 months after the kiss, her mother was late coming home, and she had nothing to do. Her father had just gone out with a friend, and since there was nothing interesting on the TV, she began examining her own body, in the hope that she might find some unwanted hair which could immediately tweezered out. To her surprise, she noticed a small gland above her vagina. She began touching it and found that she couldn't stop. The feelings provoked were so strong and so pleasurable, and her whole body, particularly the part she was touching, became tense. After a while, she began to enter a kind of paradise. The feelings grew in intensity, until she noticed that she could no longer see or hear clearly. Everything appeared to be tinged with yellow, and then she moaned with pleasure and had her first orgasm. Orgasm. It was like floating up to heaven and then parachuting slowly d0mn to earth again. Her body was drenched in sweat, but she felt complete, fulfilled and full of energy. If that was what sex was. How wonderful! Not like in erotic magazines in which everyone talked about pleasure, but seemed to be grimacing in pain. And no need for a man who liked a woman's IUT, but had no time for her feelings. She could do it on her own. She did it again, this time imagining that a famous movie star was touching her, and once more she floated up to paradise and parachuted d0mm again, feeling even more energized. Just as she was about to do it for a third time, her mother came home. Maria talked to her girlfriends about her new discovery, but saying that she had only discovered it a few hours before. All of them apart from two, knew what she was talking about, but none of them had ever dared to raise the subject. It was Maria's turn to feel like a revolutionary, to be the leader of the group, inventing an absurd secret confidential game, which involved asking everyone their favorite method of masturbation. She learned various different techniques, like lying under the covers in the heat of summer, because, one of her friends assured her, sweating helped. Using a goose feather to touch yourself there. She didn't yet know what the place was called. Letting a do it to you. Maria thought this unnecessary. Using the spray and the bidet. She didn't have one at home, but she would try to as soon as she visited one of her richer friends. Anyway, once she had discovered masturbation and learned a few of the techniques suggested by her friends, she abandoned forever the idea of a religious life. Masturbation gave her enormous pleasure, and yet the church seemed to imply that sex was the greatest of sins. She heard various tales from those same girlfriends. Masturbation gave you spots, could lead to madness or even pregnancy. Nevertheless, despite all these risks, she continued to pleasure herself at least once a week, usually on Wednesdays, when her father went out to play cards with his friends. At the same time, she grew more and more insecure in her relationships with boys, and more determined to leave the place where she lived. She fell in love a third time and a fourth. She knew how to kiss now, and when she was alone with her boyfriends, she touched them and allowed herself to be touched, but something always were wrong, and the relationship would end precisely at the moment when she was sure that this was the person with whom she wanted to spend the rest of her life. After a long time, she came to the conclusion that men brought on pain, frustration, suffering and a sense of time drag. In one afternoon, watching a mother playing with her 2-year-old son, she decided that she could still think about husband, children, and a house with a sea view, but that she would never fall in love again, because love spoiled everything. And so Maria's adolescent years passed. She grew prettier and prettier, and her sad, mysterious air brought her many suitors. She went out with one boy and with another, and dreamed and suffered, despite her promise to herself ever to fall in love again. On one such date, she lost her virginity on the back seat of a car. She and her boyfriend were touching each other with more than usual ardor. The boy got very worked up, and she, weary of being the only virgin amongst her group of friends, allowed him to penetrate her. Unlike masturbation, which took her up to even, this hurt her and caused a trickle of blood which left a stain on her skirt that took ages to wash out. There wasn't the magical sensation of her first kiss, the heron seeing, the sunset, the music, but she would rather not think about that. She made love with the same boy a few more times, although she had to threaten him first, saying that if he didn't, she would tell her father he had raped her. She used time as a way of learning, trying in every way she could to understand what pleasure there was in having sex with a partner. She couldn't understand it. Masturbation was much less rebel and far more rewarding. But all the magazines, the TV programs, books, girlfriends, everything, absolute everything, said that a man was essential. Maria begged to think that she must have some unspeakable sexual problem, so she concentrated still more on her studies and for a while, forgot about that marvelous, murderous thing called love. From Maria's diary, when she was 17, my aim is to understand love. I know how alive I felt when I was in love, and I know that everything I have now, however interesting it might seem, doesn't really excite me. But love is a terrible thing. I've seen my girlfriends suffer and I don't want the same thing to happen to me. They used to laugh at me and my innocence, but now they ask me how it is I manage men so well. I smile and say nothing, because I know that the remedy is worse than the pain. I simply don't fall in love. With each day that passes, I see more clearly how fragile men are, how inconstant, insecure and surprising they are. A few of my girlfriends' fathers have propositioned me, but I've always refused. At first, I was shocked, but now I think it's just the way men are. Although my aim is to understand love, and although I suffer to think of the people to whom I gave my heart, I see that those who touched my heart failed to arouse my body, and that those who aroused my body failed to touch my heart. She turned 19, having finished secondary school, and earned a job in a draper's shop, where her boss promptly fell in love with her. By then, however, Maria knew how to use a man, without being used by him. She never let him touch her, although she was always very coquettish, conscious of the power of her beauty. The power of beauty, what must the world be like for ugly women? She had some girlfriends who no one ever invited at parties or who men were never interested in. Incredible though it might seem, these girls placed far greater value on the little love they received, suffered immensely when they were rejected and tried to face the future looking for other things beyond getting all dressed up for someone else. They were more independent, took more interest in themselves, although, in Maria's imagination, the world for them must seem unbearable. She knew how attractive she was, and although she rarely listened to her mother, there was one thing her mother said that she never forgot: "Beauty, my dear, doesn't last." With this in mind, she continued to keep her boss at arm's length, though without putting him off completely. Diaz brought her a considerable increase in salary. She didn't know how long she would be able to string him along with the mere hope of one day getting her into bed, but at least she was earning good money meanwhile. Also paid her overtime for working late. Her boss liked having her around, perhaps worried that if she went out night, she might find the great love of her life. She worked for 2 years solidly, paid money each month to parents for her keep, and, at last, she did it. She saved enough money to go and spend a week's holiday in the place of her dreams, the place where film and TV stars live. Picture postcard image of her country, Rio de Janeiro. Her boss offered to go with her and to pay all, going to one of the most dangerous places in the world. One condition her mother had laid down was that she had to stay at the house of a cousin trained in judo. The truth was quite different. She didn't want anyone at all, to spoil what would be her first week of total freedom. She wanted to do everything: swim in the sea, speak to complete strangers, look in shop windows, and be prepared for a Prince Charming to appear and carry her off for good. "What's a week after all?" she said with a seductive smile, hoping that she was. "It will pass in a flash, and I can be back at work." Saddened, her boss resisted at first, but finally accepted her decision, for at the time he was making secret plans to expenses. But Maria lied to him, saying that, since she asked her to marry him as soon as she got back, and he didn't want to spoil everything by appearing too pushy. Arya traveled for 48 hours by bus, checked into a besides, "Sir," she said, "you can't just leave the SE Hotel in Copacabana, Copacabana. That beach, that without some reliable person to look after it." "Don't call me sir," he said, and Maria saw in his face something she recognized, the flame of love. And even she had unpacked her bags, she cabbed the bikini she had bought, put it on, and despite the cloudy weather, made straight for the beach. She looked surprised because she had always thought he was of the sea fearfully, but ended up wading awkwardly into its interested in sex, and yet, his eyes were saying the exact opposite. "I can give you a house, a family, some money." No one on the beach noticed that this was her first-year parents. Thinking of the future, she decided to stay intact with the ocean, with the goddess Lemongia, the fire, maritime currents, the foaming waves, and, on the other hand, she said that she would really miss the job, as well as colleagues she just adored working with. She was careful not to mention anyone in particular, leaving the mist hanging in the air. Did colleague mean him, and our aiders? No one on the beach noticed that this was her first contact with the ocean, with the goddess Lemongia, the maritime currents, the foaming waves, and, on the other day of the Atlantic, with the coast of Africa and its lions. When she came out of the water, she was approached by a woman trying to selling whole food sandwiches, by a handsome black man who asked if she wanted to go out, promised to take great care of her purse and her hon with him that night, and by another man who didn't speak a word of Portuguese but who asked, using gestures, if she would like to have a drink of coconut water. Maria bought a sandwich because she was too embarrassed to say no, but she avoided speaking to the two strangers. She felt suddenly disappointed with herself. Now that she had the chance to do anything she wanted, why is she behaving in this ridiculous manner? Finding no-go explanation, she sat down to wait for the sun to come out from behind the clouds, still surprised at her own corg and at how cold the water was, even in the height of summer. However, the man who couldn't speak Portuguese reappeared at her side bearing a drink, which he offered her. Relieved not to have to talk to him, she drank the coconut water and smiled at him, and he smiled back. After some time, they kept up this comfortable, meaningless conversation, a smile here, a smile there, until the man took a small red dictionary out of his pocket and said, "A strange accent, bonita, pretty." She smiled again. However much she wanted to meet her Prince Charming, one should at least speak her language and be slightly younger. The man went on leafing through the little book. "Supper tonight." Then he said, "One Switzerland." And he completed this with words that sound like the bells of paradise in whatever language they are spoken. Work. Dollars. Maria did not know any restaurant called Switzerland, and could things really be that easy and dreams so quick? "I filled?" She erred on the side of caution. "Thank you very much for the invitation, but I already have a job and I'm not interested in buying any dollars." The man, who understood not a word she said, was growing desperate. After many more smiles back and forth, he left her for a few minutes and returned with an interpreter. Through him, he explained that he was from Switzerland, the country, not a restaurant, and that he would like to have supper with her, in order to talk to her about a possible job offer. The interpreter, who introduced himself as the person in charge of foreign tourists and security in the hotel where the man was staying, added on his own account, "I'd accept if I were you. He's an important impresario looking for new talent to work in Europe. If you like, I can put you in touch with some other people who accepted his invitation, got rich and are now married with children who don't have to worry about L1T being mugged or unemployed." Then, trying to impress her with his grasp of international culture, he said, "Besides, Switzerland makes excellent chocolates and cheeses." Maria's only stage experience had been in the Passion play that the local council always put on during Holy Week, and in which she had had a walk-on part as a aider seller. She had barely slept on the bus, but she was excited by the sea, tired of eating sandwiches, whole food or otherwise, and confused because she didn't know anyone and needed to find a friend. She had been in similar situations before, in which a man promises everything and gives nothing, so she knew that all this talk of acting was just a way of getting her interested. However, convinced that the Virgin had presented her with Di's chance, convinced that she must enjoy every second of her week's holiday, and because a visit to a good restaurant would provide her with something to talk when she went home, she decided to accept the invitation, as long as the interpreter came too, for she was already getting tired of smiling and pretending that she could understand what the foreigner was saying. The only problem was also the gravest one: she did not have anything suitable to wear. A woman never admits to such dyings. She would find it easier to admit that her husband had betrayed her than to reveal the state of her wardrobe, but since she did not know these people and might well never see them again, she felt that she had nothing to lose. "I've just arrived from the Northeast and I haven't got the right clothes to wear to a restaurant." Through the interpreter, the man told her not to worry and asked for the address of her hotel. That evening, she received a dress the like of which she had never seen in her entire life, accompanied by a pair of shoes that must have cost as much as she earned in a year. She felt that Di's was the beginning of the road she had so longed for during her childhood and adolescence in the Sertão, the Brazilian backlands, putting up with the constant droughts, the boys with no future, the poor but honest town, the dull, repetitive way of life. She was ready to be transformed into the princess of the universe. A man had offered her work, dollars, a pair of exorbitantly expensive shoes and a dress straight out of a fairy tale. All she lacked was some makeup, but the receptionist at her hotel took pity on her and helped her out, first warning her not to assume that every foreigner was trustworthy or that every man in Rio was a mugger. Maria ignored the warning, put on her gifts from heaven, spent hours in front of the mirror, regretting not having brought a camera with her in order to record the moment, only to realize that she was late for her date. She raced off, just like Cinderella, to the hotel where the Swiss gentleman was staying. To her surprise, the interpreter told her that he would not accompany them. "Don't worry about the language, what matters is whether or not he feels comfortable with you." "But how can he if he doesn't understand what I'm saying?" "Precisely. You don't need to talk, it's all a question of vibes." Maria didn't know what vibes were, where she came from. People needed to exchange words, phrases, questions, and answers whenever they met. But Malison, the name of the interpreter cum security officer, assured her that in Rio de Janeiro and the rest of the world, things were different. "He doesn't need to understand, just make him feel at ease. He's a widower with no children, he's MNS a nightclub and is looking for Brazilian women who want to work abroad." I said you weren't the type, but he insisted, saying that he had fallen in love with you when he saw you coming out of the water. He thought your bikini was lovely too. He paused. "But, frankly, if you want to find a boyfriend here, you'll have to get a different bikini. No one, apart from this Swiss guy, will go for it, it's really old-fashioned." Maria pretended that she hadn't heard. Malison went on, "I don't think he's interested in just having a bit of a fling. He reckons you've got what it takes to become the main attraction at his club. Of course, he hasn't seen you sing or dance, but you could learn all that, whereas beauty is something you're born with. These Europeans are all the same, they come over here and imagine that all Brazilian women are really sensual and know how to samba. If he's serious, I'd advise you to get a signed contract and have the signature verified at the Swiss consulate before leaving the country. I'll be on the beach tomorrow, opposite the hotel, if you want to talk to me about anything." The Swiss man, all smiles, took her arm and indicated the taxi awaiting them. "If he has other intentions, and you have too, then the normal price is $300 a night. Don't accept any less." Before she could say anything, she was on her way to the restaurant, with the man rehearsing the words he wanted to say. The conversation was very simple: work, dollars, Brazilian star. Maria, meanwhile, was still thinking about what the interpreter cum security officer had said, $300 a night. That was a fortune. She didn't need to suffer for love, she could play Di's man along just as she had her boss at the shop, get married, have children, and give her parents a comfortable life. What did she have to lose? He was old and he might die before too long, and then she would be rich. These Swiss men obviously had too much money and not enough women back home. They said little over the meal, just the usual exchange of smiles, and Maria gradually began to understand what Moffelsen had meant by vibes. The man showed her an album containing writing in a language that she did not know, photos of women in bikinis, doubtless better and more daring than the one she had worn that afternoon, newspaper cuttings, garish leaflets in which the only word she recognized was Brazil, wrongly spelled. Hadn't they taught him at school that it was written with an V? She drank a lot, afraid that the man would proposition her. After all, even though she had never done DIs in her life before, no one could turn their nose up at teary $100, and things always seem simpler with a bit of alcohol inside you, especially if you're among strangers. But the man behaved like a perfect gentleman, even holding her chair for her when she sat D0mm and got up. In the end, she said that she was tired and arranged to meet him on the beach the following day, pointing to her watch, showing him the time, making the movement of the waves with her hands and saying "Amana, tomorrow," very slowly. He seemed pleased and looked at his 0MRN watch, possibly Swiss, and agreed on the time. She did not go to sleep straight away. She dreamed that it was all a dream. Then she woke up and saw that it wasn't. There was the dress draped over the chair in her modest room, the beautiful shoes, and that rendezvous on the beach. From Maria's diary, on the day that she met the Swiss man, everything tells me that I am about to make a wrong decision, but making mistakes is just part of life. What does the world want of me? Does it want me to take no risks, to go back where I came from because I didn't have the courage to say yes to life? I made my first mistake when I was 11 years old, when that boy asked me if I could lend him a pencil. Since then, RVE realized that sometimes you get no second chance and that it's best to accept the gifts the world offers you. Of course it's risky, but is the risk any greater than the chance of the bus that took 48 hours to bring me here having an accident? If I must be faithful to someone or something, then I have, first of all, to be faithful to myself. If I am looking for true love, I first have to get the mediocre loves out of my system. The little experience of life I've had has taught me that no one 0MNs anything, that everything is an illusion, and that applies to material as well as spiritual things. Anyone who has lost something they thought was theirs forever, as has happened often enough to me already, finally comes to realize that nothing really belongs to them, and if nothing belongs to me, then there's no point wasting my time looking after things that aren't mine. It's best to live as if today were the first, or last, day of my life. The next day, together with Mailson, the interpreter come security office rand now, according to him, her agent. She said that she would accept the Swiss man's offer, as long as she had a document provided by the Swiss consulate. The foreigner, who seemed accustomed to such demands, said that this was something he wanted too, since, if she was to work in his country, she needed a piece of paper proving that no one there could do the job she was proposing to do, and this was not particularly difficult, given that Swiss women had no particular talent for the samba. Together they went to the city center, and the security officer come interpreter come agent demanded a cash advance as soon as the contract was signed, 30% of the $500 she received. That's a week's payment in advance. 1 week, you understand. You'll be earning $500 a week from now on, but with no deductions, because I only get a commission on the first payment. Up until then, travel and the idea of going far away had just been a dream, and dreaming is very pleasant as long as you are not forced to put your dreams into practice. That way, we avoid all the risks, frustrations and difficulties, and when we are old, we can always blame other people, preferably our parents, our spouses, or our children, for our failure to realize our dreams. Suddenly, there was the opportunity she had been so eagerly awaiting, but which she had hoped would never come. How could she possibly deal with the challenges and the dangers of a life she did not know? How could she leave behind everything she was used to? Why had the Virgin decided to go this far? Maria consoled herself with the thought that she could change her mind at any moment. It was all just a silly game, something different to tell her friends about when she went back home. After all, she lived more than 1,000 kilometers from there and she now had $350 in her purse, so if, tomorrow, she decided to pack her bags and run away. There was no way they would ever be able to track her down again. In the afternoon following their visit to the consulate, she decided to go for a walk on her 0 by the sea, where she looked at the children, the volleyball players, the beggars, the drunks, the sellers of traditional Brazilian artifacts, made in China, the people jogging and exercising as a way of fending off old age, the foreign tourists, the mothers with their children, and the pensioners playing cards at the far end of the promenade. She had come to Rio de Janeiro, she had been to a 5-star restaurant and to a consulate, she had met a foreigner, she had an agent, she had been given a present of a dress and a pair of shoes that no one, absolutely no one, back home could ever have afforded. And now what? She looked out to sea. Her geography lessons told her that if she set off in a straight line, she would reach Africa, with its lions and jungles full of gorillas. However, if she headed in a slightly more northerly direction, she would end up in the enchanted kingdom known as Europe, with its Eiffel Tower, Euro Disney, and Leaning Tower of Pizza. What did she have to lose? Like every Brazilian girl, she had learned to samba even before she could say mama. She could always come back if she didn't like it, and she had already learned that opportunities are made to seized. She had spent a lot of her life saying no to things to which she would have liked to say yes, determined to try only those experiences she could control certain affairs she had had with men, for example. Now she was facing the unknown, as unknown as this sea had once been to the navigators who crossed it, or so she had been told in history classes. She could always say no, but would she then spend the rest of her life brooding over it, as she still did over the memory of the little boy who had once asked to borrow a pencil and had then disappeared, her first love? She could always say no, but why not try saying yes this time? For one very simple reason, she was a girl from the backlands of Brazil, with no experience of life apart from a good school, a vast knowledge of TV soaps and the certainty that she was beautiful. That wasn't enough with which to face the world. She saw a group of people laughing and looking at the sea, afraid to go in. 2 days ago, she had felt the same thing, but now she was no longer afraid. She went into the water whenever she wanted, as if she had been born there. Wouldn't it be the same in Europe? She made a silent prayer and again asked the Virgin Mary's advice, and seconds later, she seemed perfectly at ease with her decision to go ahead, because she felt protected. She could always come back, but she would not necessarily get another chance of a trip like this. It was worth taking the risk, as long as the dream survived the 48-hour journey back home in a bus with no air conditioning, and as long as the Swiss man didn't change his mind. She was in such good spirits that when he invited her out to supper again, she wanted to appear alluring and took his hand in hers, but he immediately pulled away, and Maria realized, with a mixture of fear and relief, that he was serious about what he said. "Samba star," said the man. "Lovely Brazilian samba star. Travel next week." This was all well and good, but travel next week was out of the question. Maria explained that she couldn't take a decision without first consulting her family. The Swiss man was furious and showed her a copy of the signed contract, and for the first time she felt afraid. "Contract," he said. Even though she was determined to go home, she decided to consult her agent Maelson first. After all, he was being paid to advise her. Maelson, however, seemed more concerned with seducing a German tourist who had just arrived at the hotel and who was sunbathing topless on the beach, convinced that Brazil was the most liberal country in the world, having failed to notice that she was the only woman on the with her breasts exposed and that everyone was eyeing her rather uneasily. It was very hard to get him to pay attention to what she was saying. "But what if I change my mind?" insisted Maria. "I don't know what's in the contract, but I suppose he might have you arrested. He'd never be able to find me." "Exactly. So why worry?" The Swiss man, on the other hand, having spent $500, as well as paying out for a pair of shoes, a dress, 2 suppers, and various fees for the paperwork at the consulate, was beginning to get worried, and so, since Maria kept insisting on the need to talk to her family, he decided to buy 2 plane tickets and go with her to the place where she had been born, as long as it could all be resolved in 48 hours and they could still travel to Europe the following week, as agreed. With a smile here and a smile there, she was beginning to understand that this was all in the documents she had signed and that, when it came to seductions, feelings, and contracts, one should never play around. It was a surprise and a source of pride to the small town to see its lovely daughter Maria arrive accompanied by a foreigner who wanted to make her a big star in Europe. The whole neighborhood knew, and her old school friends asked, "How did it happen?" "I was just lucky." They wanted to know if such things were always happening in Rio de Janeiro, because they had seen similar scenarios in TV soaps. Maria would not be pinned down, wanting to place a high value on her personal experience and thus convince her friends that she was someone special. She and the man went to her house where he handed round leaflets, with Brazil spelled with a Z, and the contract, while Maria explained that she had an agent now and intended following a career as an actress. Her mother, seeing the diminutive bikinis worn by the girls in the photos that the foreigner was showing her, immediately gave them back and preferred to ask no questions. All that mattered was that her daughter should be happy and rich, or unhappy, but at least rich. "What's his name?" "Roger." "Rodrigo. I had a cousin called Rodrigo." The man smiled and clapped, and they all realized that he hadn't understood a word. Maria's father said, "He's about the same age as me." Her mother told him not to interfere with their daughter's happiness. Since all seamstresses talk a great deal to their customers and acquire a great deal of knowledge about marriage and love, her advice to Maria was this: "My dear, it's better to be unhappy with a rich man than happy with a poor man, and over there you'll have far more chance of becoming an unhappy rich woman. Besides, if it doesn't work out, you can just get on the bus and come home." Maria might be a girl from the backlands, but she was more intelligent than her mother or her future husband imagined, and she said, simply to be provocative, "Mama, there isn't a bus from Europe to Brazil. Besides, I want a career as a performer, I'm not looking for marriage." Her mother gave her a look of near despair. "If you can go there, you can always come back. Being a performer, an actress, is fine for a young woman, but it only lasts as long as your looks, and they start to fade when you're about 30. So make the most of things now. Find someone who's honest and loving, and marry him. Love isn't that important. I didn't love your father at first, but money buys everything, even true love. And look at your father, he's not even rich." It was bad advice from a friend, but good advice from a mother. 48 hours later, Maria was back in Rio, though not without first having made a visit, alone, to her old place of work in order to hand in her resignation and to hear the owner of the shop say, "Yes, I'd heard that a big French impresario wanted to take you off to Paris. I can't stop you going in pursuit of your happiness, but I want you to know something before you leave." He took a medal on a chain out of his pocket. "It's the miraculous medal of Our Lady of the Graces. She has a church in Paris, so go there and pray for her protection. Look, there are some words engraved around the Virgin." Maria read, "Hail Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who turn to you. Amen. Remember to say those words at least once a day." And he hesitated, but it was getting late. "If one day you come back, I'll be waiting for you. I missed my chance to tell you something very simple: I love you. It may be too late now, but I wanted you to know." Missed chances. She had learned very early on what that meant. "I love you," though, were 3 words she had often heard during her 22 years, and it seemed to her that they were now completely devoid of meaning, because they had never turned into anything serious or deep, never translated into a lasting relationship. Maria thanked him for his words, noted them in her memory. One never knows what life may have in store for us, and it's always good to know where the emergency exit is, gave him a chaste kiss on the cheek and left without so much as a backward glance. They returned to Rio, and within a day she had her passport. Brazil had really changed, Roger said, using a few words in Portuguese and a lot of gestures, which Maria took to mean before it used to take ages. With the help of Mafalzan, the security officer cum interpreter cum agent, any other important purchases were made: clothes, shoes, makeup, everything that a woman like her could want. On the eve of their departure for Europe, they went to a nightclub, and when Roger saw her dance, he felt pleased with his choice. He was clearly in the presence of a future great star of Cabaret Cologne, this lovely dark girl with her pale eyes and hair as black as the wing of the grauna, the Brazilian bird often evoked by local authors to describe black hair. The work permit from the Swiss consulate was ready, so they packed their bags and, the following day, they were flying to the land of chocolate, clocks and cheese, with Maria secretly planning to make this man fall in love with her. After all, he wasn't old, ugly, or poor. What more could she want? She arrived feeling exhausted and, while still in the airport, her heart contracted with fear. She realized that she was completely dependent on the man at her side. She had no knowledge of the country, the language, or the cold. Roger's behavior changed as the hours passed. He no longer made any attempt to be pleasant, and although he had never tried to kiss her or to fondle her breasts, the look in his eyes grew more and more distant. He installed her in a small hotel, introducing her to another young Brazilian woman, a sad creature called Vivian, who was in charge of preparing her for the work. Vivian looked her coolly up and down, without the least show of sympathy for someone who had clearly never been abroad before. Instead of asking her how she was feeling, she got straight down to business. 11 minutes. Don't delude yourself. He flies off to Brazil whenever one of his dancers gets married, something which seems to be happening more and more frequently. He knows what you want, and I assume you do too. You're probably looking for one of three things: adventure, money, or a husband. How did she know? Was everyone looking for the same thing? Or could Vivian read other people's thoughts? All the girls here are looking for one of those three things, Vivian went on, and Maria was convinced that she really could read her thoughts. As for adventure, it's too cold to do anything and, besides, you won't earn enough to go off traveling. And as for money, once the cost of room and board has been deducted, you'll have to work for nearly a whole year just to pay for your flight back home. But I know, that isn't what you agreed. But the truth is that, like everyone else, you forgot to ask. If you had been more careful, if you had read the contract you signed, you would know exactly what you were getting yourself into, because the Swiss don't lie, they just rely on silence to help them. Maria felt the ground shifting beneath her. And as for a husband, every time a girl gets married, that represents a great financial loss for Roger, so we're forbidden to talk to the customers. If your interests lie in that direction, you'll have to run great risks. This isn't a pick-up place, like in Rue de Berne. Rue de Berne. Men come here with their wives, and the few tourists who turn up get one whiff of the family atmosphere and go looking for women elsewhere. I presume you know how to dance. Well, if you can sing as well, your salary will increase, but so will the other girls' envy. So I'd suggest that, even if you're the best singer in Brazil, forget all about it and don't even try. Above all, don't use the phone. You'll spend everything you earn on it, and that won't be much. He promised me $500 a week. Oh yeah. From Maria's diary, during her second week in Switzerland, went to the nightclub and met the dance director who comes from somewhere called Morocco, and I had to learn every step of what he, who has never set foot in Brazil, thinks is the samba. I didn't even have time to recover from the long flight. I had to start smiling and dancing on the very first night. There are 6 of us, and not one of us is happy and none of us knows what we're doing here. The customers drink and applaud, blow kisses, and privately make obscene gestures, but that's as far as it goes. I got paid yesterday, barely a tenth of what we agreed. The rest, according to the contract, will be used to pay for my flight and my stay here. According to Vivian's calculations, that will take a year, which means that during that time there's no escape. And what's the point of escaping anyway? I've only just arrived. I haven't seen anything yet. What's so awful about having to dance 7 nights a week? I used to do that for pleasure, now I do it for money and fame. My legs don't ache, the only difficult thing is maintaining that fixed smile. I can choose either to be a victim of the world or an adventurer in search of treasure. It's all a question of how I view my life. Maria chose to be an adventurer in search of treasure. She put aside her feelings, she stopped crying every night, and she forgot all about the person she used to be. She discovered that she had enough willpower to pretend that she had just been born and so had no reason to miss anyone. Feelings could wait. Now what she needed to do was to earn some money, get to know the country and return home victorious. Besides, everything around her was very like Brazil in general and her own small town in particular. The women spoke Portuguese, complained about men, talked loudly, moaned about their working hours, turned up late at the club, defied the boss, thought themselves the most beautiful women in the world, and told stories about their Prince Charmings, who were usually living miles away or were married or had no money and so sponged off them. Contrary to what she had imagined from the leaflets Roger had brought with him, the club was exactly as Vivian had said it was. It had a family atmosphere. The girls described on their work permits as samba dancers were not allowed to accept invitations or to go out with the customers. If they were caught receiving a note with someone's telephone number on it, they were suspended from work for 2 whole weeks. Maria, who had expected something livelier and more exciting, gradually allowed herself to succumb to sadness and boredom. During the first 2 weeks, she barely left the boarding house where she was living, especially when she discovered that no one spoke her language, even if she said everything very slowly. She was also surprised to learn that, unlike in her 0MRN country, the city in which she was living had 2 different names. It was Genève to those who lived there and Genebra to Brazilians. Finally, in the long, tedious hours spent in her small, TV's room, she concluded, A. She would never find what she was looking for if she couldn't express herself. In order to do that, she needed to learn the local language. B. Since all her colleagues were looking for the same thing, she needed to be different. For that particular problem, she as yet lacked both a solution or a method. From Maria's diary, 4 weeks after arriving in Genève/Genebra, RVE already been here an eternity. I don't speak the language. I spend all day listening to music on the radio, looking round my room, thinking about Brazil, longing for work to begin and, when I'm working, longing to get back to the boarding house. In other words, I'm living the future, not the present. One day, at some distant future date, I'll get my ticket home, and I can go back to Brazil, marry the owner of the draper's shop and listen to the malicious comments of those friends who, never having taken any risks themselves, can only see other people's failures. No, I can't go back like that. I'd rather throw myself out of the plane as it's crossing the ocean. Since you can't open the windows in the plane, I had never expected that. What a shame not to be able to breathe in the pure air. I will die here. But before I die, I want to fight for life. If I can walk on my own, I can go wherever I like. The following day, she enrolled in a French course that was run in the mornings, and there she met people of all creeds, beliefs, and ages, men wearing brightly colored clothes and lots of gold bracelets, women who always wore a headscarf, children who learned more quickly than the grown-ups, when it should have been the other way round, since grown-ups have more experience. She felt proud when she found out that everyone knew about her country carnival, the samba, football, and the most famous person in the world, Pelé. At first, she wanted to be nice and so tried to correct their pronunciation, it's Pelé. Pelé, but after a while, she gave up, since they also insisted on calling her Meritv, with that mania foreigners have for changing all foreign names and believing that they are always right. In the afternoons, so as to practice the language, she took her first steps around this city of 2 names. She discovered some delicious chocolate, a cheese she had never eaten before, a huge fountain in the middle of the lake, snow, which no one back home had ever touched, storks, and restaurants with fireplaces. Although she never went inside, just seeing the fire blazing away gave her a pleasant feeling of well-being. She was also surprised to find that not all the shop signs advertised clocks. There were banks too, although she couldn't quite understand why there were so many for so few inhabitants, and why she rarely saw anyone inside them. She decided, however, not to ask any questions. After 3 months of keeping a tight rein on herself at work, her Brazilian blood, as sensual and sexual as everyone thinks, made its voice heard. She fell in love with an Arab who was studying French with her on the same course. The affair lasted 3 weeks until, one night, she decided to take time off and go and visit a mountain on the outskirts of Geneva. This provoked a summons to Roger's office as soon as she arrived at work the following day. No sooner had she opened the door than she was summarily dismissed for setting a bad example to the other girls working there. A hysterical Roger said that, yet again, he had been let down, that Brazilian women couldn't be trusted. Oh dear, this mania for making generalizations about everything. She tried telling him that she had had a very high fever brought on by the sudden change in climate, but the man would not be persuaded and even claimed that he would have to go straight back to Brazil in order to find a replacement, and that he would have been far better off putting on a show using Yugoslav music and Yugoslav dancers who were far prettier and far more reliable. Maria might be young, but she was no fool, especially once her Arab lover had told her that Swiss employment laws were very strict and, since the nightclub kept back a large part of her salary, she could easily allege that she was being used for slave labor. She went back to Roger's office, this time speaking reasonable French, which now included the word lawyer. She left with a few insults and $5,000 in compensation, a sum of money beyond her wildest dreams, and all because of that magic word lawyer. Now she was free to spend time with her Arab lover, buy a few presents, take some photos of the snow, and go back home in triumph. The first thing she did was telephone her mother's neighbor to say that she was happy, had a brilliant career ahead of her, and that there was no need for her family to worry. Then, since she had to leave the room in the boarding house that Roger had arranged for her, she had no alternative but to go to her Arab boyfriend, swear undying love, convert to his religion and marry him, even if she had to wear one of those strange headscarves. After all, as everyone knew, all Arabs were extremely wealthy, and that was enough. The Arab, however, was already far away, possibly in Arabia, a country Maria had never even heard of, and, deep down, she gave thanks to the Virgin Mary because she had not been obliged to betray her religion. She now had a reasonable grasp of spoken French, enough money for her return ticket, a work permit as a samba dancer, and a current visa, so, knowing that she could always go back and marry her former boss, she decided to try to earn money with her looks. In Brazil she had read a book about a shepherd who, in searching for his treasure, encounters various difficulties, and these difficulties help him to get what he wants. She was in exactly the same position. She was aware now that the reason she had dismissed was so that she could find her true destiny, as a model. She rented a small room, with no television, but she had to live frugally until she began earning lots of money, and the following day, started doing the rounds of the agencies. They all told her that she needed to get some professional photos taken, but this, after all, was an investment in her career. Dreams don't come cheap. She spent a large part of her money on an excellent photographer, who spoke little, but was extremely demanding. He had a vast selection of clothes in his studio, and she posed for him in various outfits, sober and extravagant, and even in a bikini, of which the only person she knew in Rio de Janeiro, the security officer cum interpreter cum former agent, Mailson, would have been proud. She asked for several extra copies and sent them off to her family with a letter saying how happy she was in Switzerland. They would all think she was rich and the owner of an enviable wardrobe, and that she had been transformed into her town's most illustrious daughter. If all went to plan, and she had read enough books on positive thinking to be convinced that victory was assured, she would be greeted by a brass band on her return home and would try to persuade the mayor to have a square named after her. Since she had no permanent address, she bought a mobile phone, the sort that use prepaid phone cards, and in the days that followed, she waited for job offers. She ate in Chinese restaurants, which were the cheapest, and, to pass the time, she studied furiously. But time dragged, and the telephone didn't ring. To her surprise, no one bothered her when she went for walks by the lake, apart from a few drug pushers who always hung around in the same place, underneath one of the bridges that connect the lovely old public gardens to the newer part of the city. She began to doubt her looks, until an ex-colleague, whom she bumped into by chance in a cafe, told her that it wasn't her fault, it was the fault of the Swiss, who hate to bother anyone, and of other foreigners, who were all afraid of being arrested for sexual harassment, a concept invented to make women everywhere feel worse about themselves. From Maria's diary, one night when she lacked the courage to go out, to live or to continue waiting for the phone call that never came. Spend today outside a fun fair. Since I can't afford to fritter my money away, I thought it best just to watch other people. I stood for a long time by the roller coaster, and I noticed that most people get on it in search of excitement, but that once it starts, they are terrified and want the cars to stop. What do they expect? Having chosen adventure, shouldn't they be prepared to go the whole way? Or do they think that the intelligent thing to do would be to avoid the ups and downs and spend all their time on a carousel, going round and round on the spot? At the moment, I'm far too lonely to think about love, but I have to believe that it will happen, that I will find a job and that I am here because I chose this fate. The roller coaster is my life. Life is a fast, dizzying game. Life is a parachute jump. It's taking chances, falling over and getting up again. It's mountaineering. It's wanting to get to the very top of yourself and to feel angry and dissatisfied when you don't manage it. It isn't easy being far from my family and from the language in which I can express all my feelings and emotions, but, from now on, whenever I feel depressed, I will remember that fun fair. If I had fallen asleep and suddenly woken up on a roller coaster, what would I feel? Well, I would feel trapped and sick, terrified of every bend, wanting to get off. However, if I believe that the track is my destiny and that God is in charge of the machine, then the nightmare becomes something thrilling. It becomes exactly what it is, a roller coaster, a safe, reliable toy, which will eventually stop, but, while the journey lasts, I must look at the surrounding landscape and whoop with excitement. Although she was capable of writing very wise thoughts, she was quite incapable of following her own advice. Her periods of depression became more frequent and the phone still refused to ring. To distract herself during these empty hours, and in order to practice her French, she began buying magazines about celebrities, but realized at once that she was spending too much money, and so she looked for the nearest lending library. The woman in charge told her that they didn't lend out magazines, but that she could suggest a few books that would help improve her French. I haven't got time to read books. What do you mean you haven't got time? What are you doing? Lots of things, studying French, writing a diary, and what? She was about to say, waiting for the phone to ring, but she thought it best to say nothing. My dear, you're still very young, you've got your whole life ahead of you. Read. Forget everything you've been told about books and just read. I've read loads of books. Suddenly, Maria remembered what Mailson the security officer had told her about vibes. The librarian before her seemed a very sweet, sensitive person, someone who might able to help her if all else failed. She needed to win her over. Her instinct was telling her that Di's woman could become her friend. She quickly changed tack. But I'd like to read more. Could you help me choose some books? The woman brought her The Little Prince. She started leafing through it that same night, saw the drawings on the first page of what seemed to be a hat, but which, according to the author, all children would instantly recognize as a snake with an elephant inside it. Well, I don't think I can ever have been a child, then, she thought. To me, it looks more like a hat. In the absence of any television to watch, she accompanied the prince on his journeys, feeling sad whenever the word love appeared, for she had forbidden herself to think about the subject at the risk of feeling suicidal. However, apart from the painful, romantic scenes between a prince, a fox, and a rose, the book was really interesting, and she didn't keep checking every 5 minutes that the battery in her mobile phone was still fully charged. She was terrified of missing her big chance purely out of carelessness. Maria became a regular visitor to the library, where she would chat to the woman, who seemed as lonely as she was, ask her to suggest more books and discuss life and authors until her money had nearly run out. Another 2 weeks and she would not even have enough left to buy her ticket back to Brazil. And, since life always waits for some crisis to occur before revealing itself at its most brilliant, the phone finally rang. 3 months after discovering the word lawyer and after 2 months of living on the compensation she had received, someone from a model agency asked if Senora Maria was still at this number. The reply was a cool, long-rehearsed yes, so as not to appear too eager. She learned that an Arab gentleman, who worked in the fashion industry in his country, had been very taken by her photos and wanted to invite her to take part in a fashion show. Maria remembered her recent disappointments, but also the money that she so desperately needed. They arranged to meet in a very chic restaurant. She found herself with an elegant man, older and more charming than Roger, who asked her, "Do you know who painted that picture over there? It's a Miro. Have you heard of Joan Miro?" Maria said nothing, as if she were concentrating on the food, rather different from that in the Chinese restaurants where she normally ate. Meanwhile, she made a mental note: on her next visit to the library, she would have to ask for a book about Miro. But the Arab was saying, this was the table where Fellini always sat. "Do you know his films at all?" She said she adored them. The man began asking more probing questions and Maria, knowing that she would fail the test, decided to be straight with him. "I'm not going to spend the evening pretending to you. I can just about tell the difference between Coca-Cola and Pepsi, but that's about it. I thought we came here to discuss a fashion show." He seemed to appreciate her frankness. "We'll do that when we have our after-supper drink." There was a pause, while they looked at each other, each trying to imagine what the other was thinking. "You're very pretty," said the man. "If you come up and have a drink with me in my hotel room, I'll give you 1,000 francs. Maria understood at once. Was it the fault of the model agency? Was it her fault? Should she have found out more about the nature of this supper? It wasn't the agency's fault, or hers, or the man's. This was simply how things worked. Suddenly she missed her hometown, missed Brazil, missed her mother's arms. She remembered Maelson, on the beach, when he had mentioned a fee of $300. At the time, she had thought it funny, much more than she would have expected to receive for spending the night with a man. However, at that moment, she realized that she had no one, absolutely no one in the world she could talk to. She was alone in a strange city, a relatively experienced 22-year-old, but none of her experience could help her to decide what would be the best response. "Could you pour me some more wine, please?" The Arab man filled her glass, and her thoughts traveled faster than the little prince on his travels to all those planets. She had come in search of adventure, money, and possibly a husband. She had known that she would end up getting proposals such as this, because she was no innocent and was used to the ways of men. She still believed in model agencies, stardom, a rich husband, a family, children, grandchildren, nice clothes, a triumphant return to the place where she was born. She dreamed of overcoming all difficulties purely by dint of her own intelligence, charm, and willpower. But reality had just fallen in on her. To the man's surprise, she began to cry. He did not know what to do, caught his fear of causing a scandal and his instinctive desire to protect her. He called the waiter over in order to ask for the bill, but Maria stopped him. "No, don't do that. Pour me some more wine and just let me cry for a while." And Maria thought about the little boy who had asked to borrow a pencil, about the young man who had kissed her and how she had kept her mouth closed, about her excitement at seeing Rio for the first time, about the men who had used her and given nothing back, about the passions and loves lost along the way. Despite her apparent freedom, her life consisted of endless hours spent waiting for a miracle, for true love, for an adventure with the same romantic ending she had seen in films and read about in books. A writer once said that it is not time that changes man, nor knowledge. The only thing that can change someone's mind is love. What nonsense! The person who that clearly knew only one side of the coin. Love was undoubtedly one of the things capable of changing a person's whole life, from one moment to the next. But there was the other side of the coin, the second thing that could make a human being take a totally different course from the one he or she had planned. and that was called despair. Yes, perhaps love really could transform someone, but despair did the job more quickly. What should she do? Should she run back to Brazil, become a teacher of French and marry her former boss? Should she take a small step forward? After all, it was only one night, in a city where she knew no one and no one knew her. Would that one night and that easy money mean that she would inevitably carry on until she reached a point in the road where there was no turning back? What was happening here? A great opportunity or a test set her by the Virgin Mary? The Arab was looking around at the paintings by Joan Miro, at the place where Fellini used to have lunch, at the girl who took the coats and at the other customers arriving and leaving. "Didn't you realize?" "More wine, please," said Maria, still in tears. She was praying that the waiter would not come over and realize what was going on, and the waiter, who was watching it all from a distance, out of the corner of his eye, was praying that the man and the girl would hurry up and pay the bill, because the restaurant was full and there were people waiting. At last, after what seemed an eternity, she spoke. "Did you say 1,000 francs for one drink?" Maria was surprised by her tone of voice. "Yes," said the man, regretting having suggested it in the first place. "But I really wouldn't want. Pay the bill and let's go and have that drink at your hotel." Again, she seemed like a stranger to herself. Up until then, she had been a nice, cheerful, well-brought-up girl, and she would never have spoken like that to a stranger. But that girl, it seemed to her, had died forever. Before her lay another existence, in which drinks cost 1,000 francs or, to use a more universal currency, about $600. And everything happened as expected. She went to the Arab's hotel, drank champagne, got herself almost completely drunk, opened her legs, waited for him to have an orgasm. It didn't even occur to her to pretend to have one too, washed herself in the marble bathroom, picked up the money, and allowed herself the luxury of a taxi home. She fell into bed and slept dreamlessly all night. From Maria's diary, the next day, "I remember everything, although not the moment when I made the decision. Oddly enough, I have no sense of guilt. I used to think of girls who went to bed with men for money as people who had no other choice, and now I see that it isn't like that. I could have said yes or no, no one was forcing me to accept anything. Walk about the streets and look at all the people, and I wonder if they chose their lives? Or were they, like me, chosen by fate? The housewife who dreamed of becoming a model, the banker who wanted to be a musician, the dentist who felt he should write a book and devote himself to literature, the girl who would have loved to be a TV star, but who found herself instead working at the checkout in a supermarket. I don't feel in the least bit sorry for myself. I am still not a victim, because I could have left that restaurant with my dignity intact and my purse empty. I could have given that man sitting opposite me a lesson in morality or tried to make him see that before him sat a princess who should be wooed not bought. I could have responded in all kinds of ways, but, like most people, I let fate choose which route I should take. I'm not the only one, even though my fate may put me outside the law and outside society. In the search for happiness, however, we are all equal. None of us is happy, not the banker/musician, the dentist/writer, the checkout girl/actress, or the housewife/model. So that was how it worked. As easy as that. There she was in a strange city where she knew no one, but what had been a torment to her yesterday, today gave her a tremendous sense of freedom, because she didn't need to explain herself to anyone. She decided that, for the first time in many years, she would devote the entire day to thinking about herself. Up until then, she had always been preoccupied with what other people were thinking, her mother, her school friends, her father, the people at the model agencies, the French teacher, the waiter, the librarian, complete strangers in the street. In fact, no one was thinking anything, certainly not about her, a poor foreigner, who, if she disappeared tomorrow, wouldn't even be missed by the police. Fine. She went out early, had breakfast in her usual cafe, went for a stroll around the lake and saw a demonstration held by refugees. A woman out walking a small dog told her that they were Kurds, and Maria, instead of pretending that she knew the answer in order to prove that she was more cultivated and intelligent than people might think, asked, "Where do Kurds come from?" To her surprise, the woman didn't know. That's what the world is like. People talk as if they knew everything, but if you dare to ask a question, they don't know anything. She went into an internet cafe and discovered that the Kurds came from Kurdistan, a non-existent country, now divided between Turkey and Iraq. She went back to the lake in search of the woman and her dog, but she had gone, possibly because the dog had got fed up after half an hour of staring at a group of human beings with banners, headscarves, music, and strange cries. I'm just like that woman really. Or rather, that's what I used to be like, someone pretending to know everything, hidden away in my own silence, until that Arab guy got on my nerves, and I finally had the courage to say that the only thing I knew was how to tell the difference between two soft drinks. Was he shocked? Did he change his mind about me? Of course not. He must have been amazed at my honesty. Whenever I try to appear more intelligent than I am, I always lose out. Well, enough is enough. She thought of the model agency. Did they know what the Arab guy really wanted, in which case she had, yet again, taken for a fool, or had they genuinely thought he was going to find work for her in his country? Whatever the truth of the matter, Maria felt less alone on that grey morning in Geneva, with the temperature close to zero, the Kurds demonstrating, the trams arriving punctually at each stop, the shops setting out their jewelry in the windows again, the banks opening, the beggars sleeping, the Swiss going to work. She was less alone because by her side was another woman, invisible perhaps to passers-by. She had never noticed her presence before, but there she smiled at the invisible woman beside her who looked like the Virgin Mary, Jesus's mother. The woman smiled back and told her to be careful, things were not as simple as she imagined. Maria ignored the advice and replied that she was a grown-up, responsible for her own decisions, and she couldn't believe that there was some cosmic conspiracy being hatched against her. She had learned that there were people prepared to pay 1,000 Swiss francs for one night, for half an hour between her legs, and all she had to decide over the next few days was whether to take her 1,000 Swiss francs and buy a plane ticket back to the town where she had been born, or to stay a little longer, and earn enough to be able to buy her parents a house, some lovely clothes for herself and tickets to all the places she had dreamed of visiting one day. The invisible woman at her side said again that things weren't that simple, but Maria, although glad of this unexpected company, asked her not to interrupt her thoughts, because she needed to make some important decisions. She began to analyze, more carefully this time, the possibility of going back to Brazil. Her school friends, who had never left the town they were born in, would all say that she had been fired from the job, that she had never had the talent to be an international star. Her mother would be sad never to have received her promised monthly sum of money, although Maria, in her letters, had assured her that the post office must be stealing it. Her father would, forever after, look at her with that "I told you so" expression on his face. She would go back to working in the shop, selling fabrics, and she would marry the owner, she who had traveled in a plane, eaten Swiss cheese, learned French and walked in the snow. On the other hand, there were those drinks that had earned her 1,000 Swiss francs. It might not last very long after all, beauty changes as swiftly as the wind, but in a year, she could earn enough money to get back on her feet and return to the world, this time on her own terms. The only real problem was that she didn't know what to do, how to start. She remembered from her days at the family nightclub where she had first worked that a girl had mentioned somewhere called Rue de Berne. In fact, it had been one of the first things she had said, even before she had shown her where to put her suitcases. She went over to one of the large panels that can be found everywhere in Geneva, that most tourist-friendly of cities, which cannot bear to see tourists getting lost. For this reason the panels have advertisements on one side and maps on the other. A man was standing there, and she asked him if he knew where Rue de Berne was. He looked at her, intrigued, and asked if it was the street she was looking for or the road that went to Bern, the capital of Switzerland. "No," said Maria, "I want the street in Geneva." The man looked her up and down, then walked off without a word, convinced that he was being filmed by one of those TV programs that delight in making fools of people. Maria studied the map for 15 minutes, it's not a very big city, and finally found the place she was looking for. Her invisible friend, who had remained silent while she was studying the map, was now trying to reason with her. It wasn't a question of morality, but of setting off down a road of no return. Maria said that if she could earn enough money to go back home, then she could earn enough to get out of any situation. Besides, none of the people she passed had actually chosen what they wanted to do. That was just a fact of life. "We live in a vale of tears," she said to her invisible friend. "We can have all the dreams we like, but life is hard, implacable, sad. What are you trying to say, that people will condemn me? No one will ever know, dies is just one phase of my life." With a sad, sweet smile, the invisible friend disappeared. Maria went to the funfair and bought a ticket for the roller coaster. She screamed along with everyone else, knowing that there was no real danger and that it was all just a game. She ate in a Japanese restaurant, even though she didn't understand quite what she was eating, knowing only that it was very expensive and feeling in a mood to indulge herself in every luxury. She was happy. She didn't need to wait for a phone call now or to watch every centime she spent. Later that day, she left a message with the agency to thank them and to tell them that the meeting had gone well. If they were genuine, they would ask about the photos. If they were procurers of women, they would arrange more meetings. She walked across the bridge back to her little room and decided that, however much money and however many future plans she had, she would definitely not buy a television. She needed to think, to use all her time for thinking. From Maria's diary that night, with a note in the margin saying, "Not sure, I have discovered the reason why a man pays for a woman, he wants to be happy. He wouldn't pay 1,000 francs just to have an orgasm. He wants to be happy. I do too, everyone does, and yet no one is. What have I got to lose if, for a while, I decide to become it's a difficult word to think or even write, but let's be blunt, what have I got to lose if I decide to become a prostitute for a while? Honor. Dignity. Self-respect. Although, when I think about it, I've never had any of those dyings. I didn't ask to be born, I've never found anyone to love me, I've always made the wrong decisions, now I'm letting life decide for me." The agency phoned the next day and asked about the photos and when the fashion show was being held, since they got a percentage of every job. Maria, realizing that they knew nothing about what had happened, told them that the Arab gentleman would be in touch with them. She went to the library and asked for some books about sex. If she was seriously considering the possibility of working, just for a year, she had told herself, in an area about which she knew nothing, the first thing she needed to know was how to behave, how to give pleasure and receive money in return. She was most disappointed when the librarian told her that, since the library was a government-funded institution, they only had a few technical works. Maria read the index of one of these books and immediately returned it. They said nothing about happiness, they talked only about dull things such as erection, penetration, impotence, precautions. She did for a moment consider borrowing the psychology of frigidity in women, since, in her own case, although she very much enjoyed being possessed and penetrated by a man, she only ever reached orgasm through masturbation. She wasn't there in search of pleasure, however, but work. She thanked the librarian, and went to a shop where she made her first investment in that possible career looming on the horizon, clothes which she considered to be sexy enough to arouse men's desire. Then she went straight to the place she had found on the map. Rue de Berne. At the top of the street was a church, oddly enough, very near the Japanese restaurant where she had had supper the night before, then some shops selling cheap watches and clocks, and, at the far end, were the clubs she had heard about, all of them closed at that hour of the day. She went for another walk around the lake, then, without a tremor of embarrassment, bought 5 pornographic magazines in order to study the kind of thing she would have to do, waited for darkness to fall and then went back to Rue de Berne. There she chose at random a bar with the alluringly Brazilian name of Copacabana. She hadn't decided anything, she told herself. It was just an experiment. She hadn't felt so well or so free in all the time she had been in Switzerland. "I'm looking for work," she told the owner, who was washing glasses behind the bar. The place consisted of a series of tables, a few sofas around the walls and, in one corner, a kind of dance floor. Nothing doing. "If you want to work here legally you have to have a work permit." Maria showed him hers and the man's mood seemed to improve. "Got any experience?" She didn't know what to say. If she said yes, he would ask her where she had worked before. If she said no, he might turn her down. "I'm typing a book." The idea had come out of nowhere, as if an invisible voice had come to her aid. She saw that the man knew she was lying, but was pretending to believe her. "Before you make any decision, talk to some of the other girls. We get at least 6 Brazilian women in every night, that way you can find out exactly what to expect." Maria was about to say that she didn't need any advice from anyone and that, besides, she hadn't come to a decision just yet, but the man had already moved off to the other side of the bar, leaving her on her own. Without even a glass of water to drink, the women started to arrive, and the owner called over some of the Brazilians and asked them to talk to the new arrival. None of them seemed very willing. Fear of competition, Maria assumed. The sound system was turned on and a few Brazilian songs were played. Well, the place was called Copacabana. Then some Asiatic-looking women came in, along with others who seemed to have come straight from the snowy, romantic mountains around Geneva. She had been standing there for nearly 2 hours, with nothing to drink and just a few cigarettes, filled by a growing sense that she was definitely making the decision. The words, "What am I doing here?" kept repeating over and over in her head, and feeling increasingly irritated by the complete lack of interest on the part of both the owner and the other women, when, finally, one of the Brazilian girls came over to her. "What made you choose DI's place?" Maria could have resorted to that story about writing a book, or she could, as she had with the Kurds, with Miro, and with Fellini, simply tell the truth. "To be perfectly honest, I don't know where to start or if I want to start." The other woman seemed surprised by such a frank, direct answer. She took a sip of what looked like whiskey, listened to the Brazilian song they were playing, made some comment about missing her home, then said that there wouldn't be many customers that night. A big international conference being held near Geneva had been cancelled. In the end, when she saw that Maria still hadn't left, she said, "Look, it's very simple, you just have to stick to 3 basic rules. First, never fall in love with anyone you work with or have sex with. Second, don't believe any promises and always get paid up front. Third, don't use drugs." There was a pause. "And start now. If you go home tonight without having got your first client, you'll have second thoughts about it and you won't have the courage to come back." Maria had gone there more for a consultation, to get some feedback on her chances of finding a temporary job. She found herself confronted by the feeling that so often pushes people into making hasty decisions: despair. "All right. I'll start tonight." She didn't mention that she had, in fact, started yesterday. The woman went up to the mvner, whom she called Milan, and he came over to talk to Maria. "Have you got nice underwear on?" No one, her boyfriends, the Arab, her girlfriends, far less a stranger, had ever asked her that question. But that was what life was like in that place, straight to the point. "I'm wearing pale blue pants. And no bra," she added provocatively. But all she got was a reprimand. "Tomorrow, wear black pants, bra, and stockings. Taking off your clothes is all part of the ritual." Without more ado, and on the assumption now that he was talking to someone who was about to start work, Milan introduced her to the rest of the ritual. The Copacabana should be a pleasant place to spend time, not a brothel. The men came into that bar wanting to believe that they would find a lady on her own. If anyone came over to her table and wasn't intercepted en route, because some clients were exclusive to certain girls, he would probably say, "Would you like a drink?" To which Maria could say yes or no. She was free to choose the company she kept, although it wasn't advisable to say no more than once a night. If she answered in the affirmative, she should ask for a fruit juice cocktail, which just happened to be the most expensive drink on the drinks list. Absolutely no alcohol or letting the customer choose for her. Then, she should accept any invitation to dance. Most of the clientele were familiar faces and, apart from the special clients, about whom he did not go into any further detail, none of them represented any danger. The police and the Department of Health demanded monthly blood samples, to check that they weren't carrying any sexually transmitted diseases. The use of condoms was obligatory, although there was no way of checking if DI's rule was or wasn't being followed. She should never, on any account, cause any kind of scandal. Milan was a respectable married man, concerned for his reputation and the good name of his club. He continued explaining the ritual. After dancing, they would return to the table, and the customer, as if he were saying something highly original, would invite her to go back to his hotel with him. The normal price was 350 francs, of which 50 francs went to Milan, for the hire of the table, a trick to avoid any future legal complications and accusations of exploiting sex for financial gain. Maria tried to say, "But I earned 1,000 francs for." The owner made as if to move off, but the other Brazilian woman, who was listening into the conversation, said, "She's just joking." And turning to Maria, she said in clear, loud Portuguese, "This is the most expensive place in Geneva. Never do that again." He knows what the going rate is, and he knows that no one pays 1,000 francs to go to bed with anyone, except, of course, the special clients, but only if you get lucky and you have the right qualifications. Milan's eyes. Later, Maria found out that he was a Yugoslav who had been living there for 20 years, left no room for doubt. "The price is 350 francs. "Right," said a humbled Maria. First, he had asked about the color of her underwear, now he was deciding how much her body was worth. But she had no time to think, the man was still issuing instructions. She must never accept invitations to anyone's house or to a hotel that had less than 5 stars. If the client had nowhere to take her, she was to go to a hotel located 5 blocks from there, and should always take a taxi so that the women who worked in the other clubs in Rue de Berne didn't get to know her face. Maria didn't believe this last reason. She thought that the real reason was that she might get an offer of better working conditions in another club. She kept her thoughts to herself, however. Arguing about the price was bad enough. "I'll say this again, just like policemen in the movies, never drink while on duty. I'll leave you now, it'll start getting busy soon." "Say thank you," said the other Brazilian woman in Portuguese. Maria thanked him. The man smiled, but he had not yet finished his list of recommendations. "I forgot something. The time between ordering a drink and leaving the club should never, under any circumstances, exceed 45 minutes, and in Switzerland, with clocks all over the place, even Yugoslavs and Brazilians must learn to be punctual. Just remember, I'm feeding my children on your commission." She would remember. He gave her a glass of sparkling mineral water with a slice of lemon in it, a drink that could easily pass for a gin and tonic, and asked her to wait. Gradually the club began to fill up. Men came in, looked around, sat down on their own, and immediately one of the women would go over to them, as if they were at a party where everyone has known each other for ages, and as if they were just taking time out to have a little fun after a hard day at work. Every time a man found a parmer, Maria gave a sigh of relief, even though she was now feeling much more comfortable. Perhaps it was because it was Switzerland, perhaps it was because, sooner or later, she would find adventure, money, or a husband, as she had always dreamed she would. Perhaps, she suddenly realized, it was because it was the first time in many weeks that she had been out at night into a place where there was music playing and where she could, now and then, hear someone speaking Portuguese. She was having fun with the other girls around her, laughing, drinking fruit juice cocktails, talking brightly. None of them had come up to her to say hello or to wish her success in her new profession, but that was perfectly normal. After all, she was a rival, a competitor, competing for the same trophy. Instead of feeling depressed, she felt proud. She was fighting for herself. She wasn't some helpless person. She could, if she wanted to, open the door and leave that place for good, but she would always know that she had at least had the courage to come that far, to negotiate and discuss things about which she had never in her life even dared to think. She wasn't a victim of fate, she kept telling herself. She was running her own risks, pushing beyond her own limits, experiencing dyings which, one day, in the silence of her heart, in the tedium of old age, she would remember almost with nostalgia, however absurd that might seem. She was sure that no one would approach her, and tomorrow it would all seem like some mad dream that she would never dare to repeat, for she had just realized that being paid 1,000 francs for one night only happens once. Perhaps she would be better off buying a plane ticket back to Brazil. To make the time pass more quickly, she began to work out how much each of the other girls would earn. If they went out 3 times a night, they would earn, for every 4 hours of work, the equivalent of what it would have taken her 2 months to earn at the shop. Was that a lot? She had earned 1,000 francs for one night, but perhaps that had just been beginner's luck. At any rate, an ordinary prostitute could earn more, much more than she would ever earn teaching French back home. And all they had to do was spend some time in a bar, dance, spread their legs, and that was that. They didn't even have to talk. Money was one motivation, she thought, but was that all? Or did the people there, the customers and the women, also enjoy themselves in some way? Was the world so very different from what she had been taught in school? If you used a condom, there was no risk. Nor was there any risk of being recognized by anyone. The only people who visit Geneva, she had been told once in her French class, were people who liked going to banks. The majority of Brazilians, however, enjoy shopping, preferably in Miami or in Paris. 300 Swiss francs a day, 5 days a week. A fortune. Why did those women keep working there when they could earn enough in a month to go back home and buy a new house for their mother? Or had they only been working there a short time? Or, and Maria felt afraid of her own question, did they enjoy it? Again she wished she could have a proper drink. The champagne had helped a lot the previous night. Would you like a drink? Before her stood a man in his 30s, wearing the uniform of some airline. The world went into slow motion, and Maria had a sense of stepping out of her 0mrn body and observing herself from the outside. Deeply embarrassed, but struggling to control her blushes, she nodded and smiled, knowing that from that moment on her life had changed forever. A fruit juice cocktail, a bit of talk. What are you doing here? It's cold, isn't it? I like this music. Oh, I prefer ABBA myself. The Swiss are a chilly lot. Are you from Brazil? Tell me about your country. Well, there's Carnival. You Brazilian women are really pretty, you know. Smile and accept the compliment, perhaps with a slightly shy look. Back to the dance floor, but all the time keeping an eye on Milan, who sometimes scratches his head and taps his wristwatch. The smell of the man's cologne. She realizes quickly that she will have to get used to all kinds of smells. At least this is perfume. They dance very close. Another fruit juice cocktail. Time is passing. Didn't Milan say 45 minutes maximum? She looks at her watch. He asks if she's expecting someone. She says a few friends of hers will be arriving in about an hour. He invites her back to his hotel. Hotel room, 350 francs. A shower after sex. Intrigued, the man remarked that no one had ever done that before. It's not Maria, it's some other person who's inside her body, who feels nothing, who mechanically goes through the motions of a ritual. She's an actress. Milan has taught her everything, even how to say goodbye to the client. She thanks him, he too feels awkward and sleepy. 11 minutes. She doesn't want to go back to the club, she wants to go home. But she has to go back to hand over the 50 francs, and then there's another man, another cocktail, more questions about Brazil, a hotel, another shower, this time, no comment, back to the bar where the owner takes his commission and tells her she can go, there aren't many customers tonight. She doesn't get a taxi, she walks the length of Rue de Berne, looking at the other clubs, at the shop windows full of clocks and watches, at the church on the corner, closed. Always closed, as usual, no one looks at her. She walks through the cold. She isn't aware of the freezing temperatures, she doesn't cry, She doesn't think about the money she has earned, she is in a kind of trance. Some people were born to face life alone, and dies is neither good nor bad, it is simply life. Maria is one of those people. She begins to try and think what has happened. She only started work today and yet she already considers herself a professional. It's as if she started ages ago, as if she had done this all her life. She experiences a strange sense of pride. She is glad she didn't run away. Now she just has to decide whether or not to carry on. If she does carry on, then she will make sure she is the best, something she has never been before. But life was teaching her, very fast, that only the strong survive. To be strong, she must the best, there's no alternative. From Maria's diary a week later, "RM not a with a soul, RM a soul that has a visible part called the body. All this week, contrary to what one might expect, I have been more conscious of the presence of Di's soul than usual. It didn't say anything to me, didn't criticize me or feel sorry for me, it merely watched me. Today, I realized why this was happening. It's been such a long time since I thought about love or anything called love. It seems to be running away from me, as if it wasn't important anymore and didn't feel welcome. But if I don't think about love, I will be nothing." When I went back to the Copacabana the second night, I was treated with much more respect. Apparently, a lot of girls do it for one night, but can't bear to go on. Anyone who does, becomes a kind of ally, a colleague, because she can understand the difficulties and the reasons or, rather, the absence of reasons for having chosen this kind of life. They all dream of someone who will come along and see in them a real woman, companion, lover, friend. But they all know, from the very first moment of each new encounter, that this simply isn't going to happen. I need to write about love. I need to think and write about love, otherwise, my soul won't survive. However important Maria thought love was, she did not forget the advice she was given on her first night and did her best to confine love to the pages of her diary. Apart from that, she tried desperately to be the best, to earn a lot of money in as short a time as possible, to think very little and to find a good reason for doing what she was doing. That was the most difficult part. What was the real reason? She was doing it because she needed to. This wasn't quite true. Everyone needs to earn money, but not everyone chooses to live on the margins of society. She was doing it because she wanted to experience something new. No, that wasn't true either. The world was full of new experiences, like skiing or going sailing on Lake Geneva, for example, but she had never been interested. She was doing it because she had nothing to lose, because her life was one of constant, day-to-day frustration. No, none of these answers was true, so it was best to forget all about it and simply deal with whatever lay along her particular path. She had a lot in common with the other prostitutes, and with all the other women she had known in her life, whose greatest dream was to get married and have a secure life. Those who didn't think like this either had a husband, almost a third of her colleagues were married, or were recently divorced. Because of that, and in order to understand herself, she tried, as tactfully as possible, to understand why her colleagues had chosen this profession. She heard nothing new, but she made a list of their responses. They said they had to help out their husband. Wasn't he jealous? What if one of her husband's friends came to the club one night? But Maria didn't dare to ask these questions. That they wanted to buy a house for their mother, her own excuse, apparently so noble, and the most common one, to earn enough money for their fair home. Colombians, Thais, Peruvians, Brazilians all loved this reason, even though they had earned enough money several times over and had immediately spent it, afraid to realize their dream, to have fun. This didn't really tally with the atmosphere in the club, and always rang false. They couldn't find any other kind of work. This wasn't a good reason either. Switzerland was full of jobs for cleaners, drivers, and cooks. None of them came up with any valid reason, and so she stopped trying to explain her particular universe. She saw that the owner, Enfilin, was quite right. No one ever again offered her 1,000 Swiss francs for the privilege of spending a few hours with her. On the other hand, no one ever complained when she asked for 350 francs, as if they already knew or only asked in order to humiliate her, or wanted to avoid any unpleasant surprises. One of the girls said, "Prostitution isn't like other businesses, beginners earn more and the more experienced earn less. Always pretend you're a beginner." Maria still didn't know who the special clients were, they had only been mentioned on the first night and no one ever spoke of them. Gradually, she picked up the most important tricks of the trade, like never asking personal questions, smiling a lot and talking as little as possible, never arranging to meet anyone outside the club. The most important piece of advice, however, came from a Filipino woman called Naya: when your client comes, you must always groan as if you were having an orgasm too. That guarantees customer loyalty. But why? They're just paying for their own satisfaction. No, that's where you're a man doesn't prove he's a man by getting an erection. He's only a real man if he can pleasure a woman. And if he can pleasure a prostitute, he'll think he's the best lover on the block. And so 6 months passed. Maria learned all the necessary lessons, for example, how the Copacabana worked. Since it was one of the most expensive places in Rue de Berne, the clientele was largely made up of executives, who had permission to get home late because they were out, having supper with clients, but these suppers could never last longer than 11 o'clock at night. Most of the prostitutes who worked there were aged between 18 and 22 and they stayed, on average, for 2 years, when they would be replaced by newer recruits. They then moved to the Neon, then to the Xenium, and the price went down as the woman's age went up, and the hours of work grew fewer and fewer. They almost all ended up in the Tropical Ecstasy, who accepted women over 30, but once they were there, they could only just earn enough to pay for their lunch and their rent by going with 1 or 2 students a day. The average fee per client was just about enough to buy a bottle of cheap wine. She went to bed with many men. She didn't care how old they were or how they were dressed, but whether she said yes or no depended on how they smelled. She had nothing against cigarettes, but she hated cheap aftershave orthos who didn't wash or whose clothes stank of booze. The Copacabana was a quiet place, and Switzerland was possibly the best country in the world in which to work as a prostitute, as long as you had a residence permit and a work permit, kept all your papers in order and paid your social security. Milan was always saying that he didn't want his children to see his name in the tabloid newspapers, and so he was as strict as a policeman when it came to keeping an eye on his employees. Once you had got past the barrier of the first or second night, it was a profession much like any other, in which you worked hard, fought off the competition, tried to maintain standards, put in the necessary hours, got a bit stressed out, complained about your workload, and rested on Sundays. Most of the prostitutes had some kind of religious faith, and attended their respective churches and masses, said their prayers and had their encounters with God. Maria, however, was struggling in the pages of her diary not to lose her soul. She discovered, to her surprise, that 1 in every 5 clients didn't want her in order to have sex, but simply to talk a little. They paid for the bar tab and the hotel room, and when the moment came for them both to take off their clothes, the man would say, "No, that won't be necessary." They wanted to talk about the pressures of work, about their unfaithful wife, about how lonely they felt, how they had no one to talk to, something she knew about all too well. At first, she found this very odd. Then, one night, she went to the hotel with an arrogant Frenchman, a headhunter for top executive jobs. He told her eyes as if he were telling her the most fascinating thing in the world, and this is what he said: "Do you know who the loneliest person in the world is? The executive with a successful career, earning an enormous salary, trusted by those above and below him, with a family to go on holiday with and children who he helps out with their homework, but who is then approached by someone like me and asked the following question: how would you like to change your job and earn twice as much?" The executive, who has every reason to feel wanted and happy, becomes the most miserable creature on the planet. Why? Because he has no one to talk to. He is tempted to accept my offer, but he can't talk about it to his work colleagues because they would do everything they could to persuade him to stay. He can't talk about it to his wife, who has been his companion in his rise up the ladder of success and understands a great deal about security, but nothing about taking risks. He can't talk to anyone about it, and there he is confronted by the biggest decision of his life. Can you imagine how that man feels? No, that man wasn't the loneliest person in the world. Maria knew the loneliest person on the face of Di's earth, herself. Nevertheless, she agreed with her client, hoping to get a big tip, which she did. But his words made her realize that she needed to find some way of freeing her clients from the enormous pressure they all seemed to be under. This meant both improving the quality of her services and the chance of earning some extra money. When she realized that releasing tension in the soul could be as lucrative as releasing tension in the body, if not more lucrative, she started going to the library again. She began asking for books about marital problems, psychology, and politics. The librarian was delighted to see that the young woman of whom she had grown so fond had stopped thinking about sex and was now concentrating on more important matters. Maria became a regular reader of newspapers, especially, where possible, the financial pages, because the majority of her clients were business executives. She sought out self-help books, because her clients nearly all asked for her advice. She read studies of the human emotions, because all her clients were in some kind of emotional pain. Maria was a respectable, rather unusual prostitute, and after 6 months, she had acquired a large, faithful, very select clientele, thus arousing the envy and jealousy, but also the admiration, of her colleagues. As for sex, it had as yet added nothing to her life. It was just a matter of opening her legs, asking them to use a condom, moaning a bit in the hope of getting a better tip. Thanks to the Filipino woman, Naya, she had learned that moaning could earn her another 50 francs, and taking a shower afterwards, hoping that the water would wash her soul clean. Nothing out of the ordinary and no kissing. For a prostitute, the kiss was sacred. Naya had taught her to keep her kisses for the love of her life, just like in the story of Sleeping Beauty, a kiss that would waken her from her slumbers and return her to the world of fairy tales, in which Switzerland was once more the country of chocolate, cows, and clocks. And no orgasms either, no pleasure or excitement. In her search to be the very best, Maria had watched a few porn movies, hoping to pick up tips for her work. She had seen a lot of interesting things, but had preferred not to try any of them out on her clients because they took too long, and Milan was happiest when the women averaged 3 men a night. By the end of the 6 months, Maria had 60,000 Swiss francs in a bank account. She ate in better restaurants, had bought a TV. She never watched it, but she liked to have it there, and was now seriously considering moving to a better apartment. Although she could easily afford to buy books, she continued going to the library, which was her bridge to the real world, a more solid and enduring world. She enjoyed chatting to the librarian, who was happy because Maria had perhaps found a boyfriend and a job, although she never asked, the Swiss being naturally shy and discreet, a complete fallacy, because in the Copacabana and in bed, they were as uninhibited, joyful, or neurotic as any other nationality. From Maria's diary: one warm Sunday evening, all men, tall or short, arrogant or unassuming, friendly or cold, have one characteristic in common: when they come to the club, they are afraid. The more experienced amongst them hide their fear by talking loudly, the more inhibited cannot hide their feelings and start drinking to see if they can drive the fear away. But I am convinced that, with a few very rare exceptions, the special clients to whom Milan has not yet introduced me, they are all afraid. Afraid of what? I'm the one who should be shaking. I'm the one who leaves the club and goes off to a strange hotel, and I'm not the one with the superior physical strength or the weapons. Men are very strange, and I don't just mean the ones who come to the Copacabana, but all the men I've ever met. They can beat you up, shout at you, threaten you, and yet they're scared to death of women really. Perhaps not the woman they married, but there's always one woman who frightens them and forces them to submit to her caprices. Even if it's their own mother. Appear confident, as if they were in perfect control of the world and of their own lives. Maria, however, could see in their eyes that they were afraid of their wife, the feeling of panic that they might not be able to get an erection, that they might not seem manly enough even to the ordinary prostitute whom they were paying for her services. If they went to a shop and didn't like the shoes they had bought, they would be quite prepared to go back, receipt in hand, and demand a refund. And yet, even though they were paying for some female company, if they didn't manage to get an erection, they would be too ashamed ever to go back to the same club again because they would assume that all the other women there would know. I'm the one who should feel ashamed for being unable to arouse them, but, no, they always blame themselves. To avoid such embarrassments, Maria always tried to put men at their ease, and if someone seemed drunker or more fragile than usual, she would avoid full sex and concentrate instead on caresses and masturbation, which always seemed to please them immensely, absurd though this might seem. Since they could perfectly well masturbate on their millimeter, she had to make sure that they didn't feel ashamed. These men, so powerful and arrogant at work, constantly having to deal with employees, customers, suppliers, prejudices, secrets, posturings, hypocrisy, fear and oppression, ended their day in a nightclub, and they didn't mind spending 350 Swiss francs to stop being themselves for a night. For a night? Now come on, Maria, you're exaggerating. It's really only 45 minutes, and if you allow time for taking off clothes, making some phony gesture of affection, having a bit of banal conversation and getting dressed again, the amount of time spent actually having sex is about 11 minutes. 11 minutes. The world revolved around something that only took 11 minutes. And of those 11 minutes in any one 24-hour day, assuming that they all made love to their wives every day, which is patently absurd and a complete lie, they got married, supported a family, put up with screaming kids, thought up ridiculous excuses to justify getting home late, ogled dozens, if not hundreds of other women with whom they would like to go for a walk around Lake Geneva, bought expensive clothes for themselves and even more expensive clothes for their wives, paid prostitutes to try to give them what they were missing, and thus sustained a vast industry of cosmetics, diet foods, exercise, pornography, and power. And yet when they got together with other men, contrary to popular belief, they never talked about women. They talked about jobs, money, and sport. Something was very wrong with civilization, and it wasn't the destruction of the Amazon rainforest or the ozone layer, the death of the panda, cigarettes, carcinogenic foodstuffs, or prison conditions, as the newspapers would have it. It was precisely the thing she was working with, sex. But Maria wasn't there to save humanity, but to increase her bank balance, survive another 6 months of solitude and another 6 months of the choice she had made, send a regular monthly sum of money to her mother, who was thrilled to learn that the earlier absence of money had been due to the Swiss post, so much less efficient than the Brazilian postal system, and to buy all the things she had always dreamed of and never had. She moved to a much better apartment, with central heating, although the summer had already arrived, and from her window she could see a church, a Japanese restaurant, a supermarket, and a very nice cafe, where she used to sit and read the newspapers. Otherwise, just as she had promised herself, it was a question of putting up with the same old routine, go to the Copacabana, have a drink and a dance, what do you think of Brazil, then back to his hotel, get the money up front, have a little conversation and know precisely which points to touch, on both body and soul, but mainly the soul, give some advice on personal problems, be his friend for half an hour, of which 11 minutes would be spent in opening her legs, closing her legs and pretending to moan with pleasure. Thanks very much, see you next week, you're very manly, you know, tell me how things went next time we meet. Oh, that's very generous of you, but really there's no need, it's been a pleasure to spend time with you. And, above all, never fall in love. That was the most important and most sensible piece of advice that the other Brazilian woman had given her, before she disappeared, perhaps because she herself had fallen in love. Because, incredible though it may seem, in just 2 months of working there, Maria had had several proposals of marriage, of which at least 3 were serious, the director of a firm of accountants, the pilot she went with on the very first night, and the owner of a shop specializing in knives. All three had promised to take her away from that life, and to give her a nice house, a future, perhaps children, and grandchildren. And all for 11 minutes a day? It wasn't possible. After her experiences at the Copacabana, she knew that she wasn't the only person who felt lonely. Human beings can withstand a week without water, 2 weeks without food, many years of homelessness, but not loneliness. It is the worst of all tortures, the worst of all sufferings. Like her, these men, and the many others who sought her company, were all tormented by that same destructive feeling, the sense that no one else on the planet cared about them. In order to avoid being tempted by love, she kept her heart for her diary. She entered the Copacabana with only her body and her brain, which was growing sharper and more perceptive all the time. She had managed to persuade herself that there was some important reason why she had come to Geneva and ended up in Rue de Berne, and every time she borrowed a book from the library she was confirmed in her view that no one wrote properly about the 11 most important minutes of the day. Perhaps that was her destiny, however hard it might seem at the moment, to write a book, relating her story, her adventure. That was it, her adventure. Although it was a forbidden word that no one dared to speak, and which most people preferred to watch on the television, in films that were sh0mm over and over at all times of the day and night, that was what she was looking for. It was a word that evoked deserts, journeys to unknown places, idle conversations with mysterious men on a boat in the middle of a river, plane journeys, cinema studios, tribes of Indians, glaciers, and Africa. She liked the idea of a book and had even thought of a title, 11 Minutes. She began to put clients into tier categories, the exterminators, in homage to a film she had enjoyed hugely, who arrived stinking of drink, pretending not to look at anyone, but convinced that everyone was looking at them, dancing only briefly and then getting straight down to the business of going back to their hotel. The pretty woman type, again named after a film, who tried to appear elegant, gentlemanly, affectionate, as if the world depended on such kindness in order to continue turning on its axis, as if they had just been walking down the street and had come into the club by chance. They were always very sweet at first and rather uncertain when they got to the hotel, but, because of that, they always proved even more demanding than the exterminators. And lastly, there was the Godfather type, named after yet another film, who treated a woman's body as if it were a piece of merchandise. They were the most genuine, they danced, talked, never gave tips, knew what they were buying and how much it was worth, and never let themselves be taken in by anything the woman of their choice might say. They were the only ones who, in a very subtle way, knew the meaning of the word adventure. From Maria's diary, on a day when she had her period and couldn't work, if I were to tell someone about my life today, I could do it in a way that would make them think me a brave, happy, independent woman. Rubbish, I am not even allowed to mention the only word that is more important than the 11 minutes, love. All my life, I thought of love as some kind of voluntary enslavement. Well, that's a lie. Freedom only exists when love is present. The person who gives him or herself wholly, the person who feels freest, is the person who loves most wholeheartedly. And the person who loves wholeheartedly feels free. That is why, regardless of what I might experience, do, or learn, nothing makes sense. I hope this time passes quickly, so that I can resume my search for myself, in the form of a man who understands me and does not make me suffer. But what am I saying? In love, no one can harm anyone else. We are each of us responsible for our own feelings and cannot blame someone else for what we feel. It hurt when I lost each of the various men I fell in love with. Now, though, I am convinced that no one loses anyone, because no one owns anyone. That is the true experience of freedom, having the most important thing in the world without owning it. Another 3 months passed, and autumn came, as did the date marked on the calendar, 90 days until her return journey home. Everything had happened so quickly and so slowly, she thought, realizing that time exists in 2 different dimensions, depending on one's state of mind, but in both sorts of time her adventure was drawing to a close. She could, of course, continue, but she could not forget the sad smile of the invisible woman who had accompanied her on that walk around the lake, telling her that things weren't that simple. However tempted she was to continue, however prepared she was for the challenges she had met on her path, all these months living alone with herself had taught her that there is always a right moment to stop something. In 90 days' time she would return to the interior of Brazil, where she would buy a small farm. She had earned rather more than she had expected, a few cows, Brazilian, not Swiss, invite her mother and father to come and live with her, take on a couple of workers, and set the business in motion. Although she believed that love is the only true experience of freedom, and that no one can possess anyone else, she still harbored a secret desire for revenge, and these formed part of her triumphal return to Brazil. After setting up the farm, she would go back to her hometown and make a large deposit in Swiss francs at the bank where the boy who had two-timed her with her best friend was working. "Hi, how are you? Don't you remember me?" he would say. She would pretend to be trying hard to remember and would end up saying that, no, she didn't. She had just come back from a year in Europe. She would say this very slowly so that all his colleagues would hear. Or, rather, Switzerland, that would sound more exotic and adventurous than France, where they have the best banks in the world. Who was he? He would mention their school days. She would say, "Ah, yes, I think I remember," but from her face it would be clear that she didn't. Vengeance would be hers, and then it would just be a matter of working hard, and when the farm was doing as well as she expected, she would be able to devote herself to the thing that mattered most in her life, finding her true love, the man who had been waiting for her all these years, but whom she had not yet had the chance to meet. Maria decided to forget all about the book entitled 11 Minutes. Now she needed to concentrate on the farm, on her future plans, otherwise, she would end up postponing her trip, a fatal risk. That afternoon, she went off to meet her best, and only friend, the librarian. She asked for a book on cattle raising and farm administration. The librarian said, "You know, a few months ago, when you came here looking for books about sex, I began to fear for you. So many pretty young girls let themselves be seduced by the illusion of easy money, forgetting that, one day, they'll be old and will have missed out on meeting the love of their life." "Do you mean prostitution?" "That's a very strong word. As I said, I'm working for a company that imports and exports meat. But if I had to become a prostitute, would the consequences be so very grave if I stopped at the right moment? After all, being young inevitably means making mistakes. That's what all the drug addicts say, that you just have to know when to stop. But none of them do. You must have been very pretty when you were younger and you were brought up in a country that respects its inhabitants. Was that enough for you to be happy? I'm proud of how I dealt with any obstacles in my life." Should she go on, thought the librarian. Yes, why not? The girl needed to learn a bit about life. "I had a happy childhood. I studied at one of the best schools in Bern, then I came to work in Geneva, where I met and married the man I loved. I did everything for him and he did everything for me. Time passed and he retired. When he was free to do exactly what he wanted with his time, his eyes grew sadder, because he had probably never really thought about himself all his life. We never had any serious arguments or any great excitements. He was never unfaithful to me and was never rude to me in public. We lived a very ordinary life, so much so that, without a job to do, he felt useless, unimportant, and, a year later, he died of cancer." She was telling the truth, but felt that she might be having a negative influence on the girl standing before her. "I still think it's best to lead a life without surprises," she concluded. "If we hadn't, my husband might have died even earlier, who knows?" Maria left, determined to learn all about farming. Since she had the afternoon free, she decided to go for a stroll and, in the upper part of the city, came across a small yellow plaque bearing a drawing of a sun and an inscription, "Road to Santiago." What did it mean? There was a bar on the other side of the road, and since she had now learned to ask about anything she didn't understand, she resolved to go in and ask. "I've no idea," said the girl serving behind the bar. It was a very expensive place, and the coffee cost 3 times the normal price. Since she had money, though, and now that she was there, she ordered a coffee and decided to spend the next hour or so learning all there was to know about farm administration. She opened the book eagerly, but found it impossible to concentrate. It was so boring. It would be much more interesting to talk to one of her clients about it. They always knew how best to handle money. She paid for her coffee, got up, thanked the girl who had served her, left a large tip. She had invented a superstitious belief according to which the more you gave, the more you got back, went over to the door, and, without realizing the importance of that moment, heard the words that would change forever her plans, her future, her farm, her idea of happiness, her female soul, her male approach to life, her place in the world. Hang on a moment. Surprised, she glanced to one side. This was a respectable bar. It wasn't the Copacabana, where men had the right to say that, although the women could always respond, "No, I'm leaving and you can't stop me." She was about to ignore the remark, but her curiosity got the better of her, and she turned towards the voice. She saw a very strange scene. Kneeling on the floor, with various paint brushes scattered around him, was a long-haired young man of about 30, or should she have said, a boy of about 30? Her world had aged very fast, who was making a drawing of a gentleman sitting in a chair, with a glass of anisette beside him. She hadn't noticed them when she came. Don't go. I've nearly finished this portrait, and I'd like to paint you as well. Maria replied, and as she did so, she created the link that was lacking in the verse. No, I'm not interested. You've got a special light about you. Let me at least do a sketch. What was a sketch? What did he mean by a special light? Besides, she was vain enough to want to have her portrait painted by someone who appeared to be a serious artist. Her imagination took flight. What if he was really famous? She would be immortalized forever in a painting that would be exhibited in Paris or in Salvador de Bahia. She would become a legend. On the other hand, what was the man doing, surrounded by all that clutter, in an expensive, perhaps usually crowded cafe? Guessing her thoughts, the waitress said softly, "He's a very well-known artist." Her intuition had been right. Maria tried not to show her feelings and to remain calm. "He comes here now and again, and he always brings an important client with him. He says he likes the atmosphere, that it inspires him. He's doing a painting of people who represent the city. It was commissioned by the town hall." Maria looked at the subject of the portrait. Again the waitress read her thoughts. "He's a chemist who apparently made some really revolutionary discovery. He won the Nobel Prize." "Don't go," said the painter again. "I'll be finished in 5 minutes. Order what you like and put it on my bill." As if hypnotized, she sat down at the bar, ordered an anisette. She wasn't used to drinking, and the only thing that occurred to her was to order the same as the Nobel Prize winner, and watched the man working. "I don't represent the city, so he must be interested in something else. But he's not really my type," she thought automatically, repeating what she always said to herself, ever since she had been working at the Copacabana. It was her salvation, her voluntary denial of the traps set by the heart. Having cleared that up, she didn't mind waiting a while. Perhaps the waitress was right. Perhaps this man could open doors to a world of which she knew nothing. She watched how quickly and adroitly he put the finishing touches to his work. It was apparently a very large canvas, but it was all rolled up, and so she couldn't see what other faces he had painted. What if this was a new opportunity? The man, she had decided that he was a man and not a boy, because otherwise she would start to feel old before her time, didn't seem the sort likely to make that kind of proposal just in order to spend the night with her. 5 minutes later, as promised, he had finished his work, while Maria concentrated hard on thinking about Brazil, about her brilliant future there, and her complete lack of interest in meeting new people who might jeopardize all her plans. "Thanks, you can move now," said the painter to the chemist, who seemed to awaken from a dream. And turning to Maria, he said simply, "Sit in that corner and make yourself comfortable. The light is wonderful." As if everything had been ordained by fate, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if she had known this man all her life or had already lived this moment in dreams and now knew what to do in reality. Maria picked up her glass of anisette, her bag, and the books on farm management, and went over to the place indicated by the man, a table near the window. He brought his brushes, the large canvas, a series of small glass bottles full of various colors and a packet of cigarettes, and knelt at her feet. "Now don't move. That's asking a lot, my life is in constant motion." Maria thought she was being terribly witty, but the man ignored her remark. Trying to appear natural because she found the way the man looked at her most discomfiting, she pointed across the road at the plaque. "What is the road to Santiago?" "It's a pilgrimage route. In the Middle Ages, people from all over Europe would come along this street, heading for a city in Spain, Santiago de Compostela." He folded over one part of the canvas and prepared his brushes. Maria still didn't know quite what to do. "Do you mean that if I followed that street, why'd he eventually get to Spain?" "Yes, in 2 or 3 months' time. But can I just ask you a favor? Stop talking, it will only take about 10 minutes. And take that package off the table." "They're books," she said, slightly irritated by his authoritarian tone. She wanted him to know that he was kneeling before a cultivated woman, who spent her time in libraries not shops. But he himself picked up the package and placed it unceremoniously on the floor. She had failed to impress him. Not, of course, that she was remotely interested in impressing him. She was off duty now and would save her seductive powers for later, for men who would pay handsomely for her efforts. Why bother striking up a relationship with a painter who might not even have enough money to buy her a coffee? A man of 30 shouldn't wear his hair so long, it looked ridiculous. Why did she assume he had no money? The waitress had said he was well known, or was it just the chemist who was famous? She studied his clothes, but that didn't help. Life had taught her that the men who took least care of their appearance, as with this painter, always seemed to have more money than the men in suits and ties. What am I doing thinking about this man? What interests me is the painting. 10 minutes of her time was not such a high price to pay for the chance of being immortalized in a painting. She saw that he was painting her alongside the Parisian chemist, and she began to wonder if, after all, he would want some kind of payment. Turn towards the window. Again she obeyed unquestioningly, which was not at all like her. She sat looking at the people passing by, at the plaque with the name of that road on it, thinking about how that road had been there for centuries, how it had survived progress and all the changes that had taken place in the world and in mankind. Perhaps it was a good omen, perhaps that painting would share the same fate and still be on display in a museum in the city in 500 years' time. The man started drawing, and, as the work progressed, she lost that initial sense of excitement and, instead, began to feel utterly insignificant. When she had gone into the cafe, she had been a very confident woman, capable of making an extremely difficult decision, leaving a job that earned her lots of money, and taking up a still more difficult challenge, running a farm back in her own country. Now, all her feelings of insecurity the world seemed to have resurfaced, a luxury no prostitute can allow herself. She finally worked out why she was feeling so uncomfortable. For the first time in many months, someone was looking at her not as an object, not even as a woman, but as something she could not even comprehend. The closest she could come to putting it into words was, "He's seeing my soul, my fears, my fragility, my inability to deal with a world which I pretend to master, but which I know nothing." Ridiculous, pure fantasy. Teed-like. "Please, don't talk," said the man. "I can see your light now." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. "I can see your firm breasts, I can see your nicely rounded thighs, I can see in you the exotic beauty of the tropics, or, at most, I can see that you want to leave this life. Let me set you up in an apartment." She was used to comments like that, but her light? Did he mean the evening light? "Your personal light," he said, realizing that she didn't know what he was talking about. Her personal light. Well, how wrong could he be, that innocent painter, who obviously hadn't learned much about life in his 30-odd years. But then, as everyone knows, women mature more quickly than men, and although Maria might not spend sleepless nights pondering her particular philosophical problems, she knew one thing: she did not have what that painter called light, and which she took to mean a special glow. She was just like everyone else. She endured her loneliness in silence, tried to justify everything she did, pretended to be strong when she was feeling weak, or weak when she was feeling strong. She had renounced love and taken up a dangerous profession, but now, as that work was coming to an end, she had plans for the future and regrets about the past, and someone like that doesn't have a special glow. That must just be his way of keeping her quiet and still and happy to be there, playing the fool. Personal light, indeed. He could have said something else, like, "You've got a lovely profile." How does light enter a house? Through the open windows. How does light enter a person? Through the open door of love. And her door was definitely shut. He must be a terrible painter. He didn't understand anything. "I've finished," he said, and started collecting up his things. Maria didn't move. She felt like asking if she could see the painting, but that might seem rude, as if she didn't trust what he had done. Curiosity, however, got the better of her. She asked and he concurred. He had painted only her face. It looked like her, but if, one day, she had seen that painting, not knowing who the model was, she would have said that it was someone much stronger, someone full of a light she didn't see reflected in the mirror. "My name's Ralph Hart. If you like, I can buy you another drink." "No, thank you." It would seem that the encounter was now taking a sadly foreseeable turn. Man tries to seduce woman. "Two more anisets, please," he said, ignoring Maria's answer. What else did she have to do? Read a boring book about farm management? Walk around the lake, as she had hundreds of times before? Or talk to someone who had seen in her a light of which she knew nothing, and on the very date marked on the calendar as the beginning of the end of her experience? What do you do? That was the question she did not want to hear, the question that had made her avoid other encounters when, for one reason or another, someone had approached her, though given the natural discretion of the Swiss, this happened only rarely. What possible answer could she give? "I work in a nightclub." Right. An enormous load fell from her shoulders, and she was pleased with all that she had learned since she had arrived in Switzerland. Ask questions: who are the Kurds? What is the road to Santiago? And answer: "I work in a nightclub," without worrying about what other people might think. "I have a feeling I've seen you before." Maria sensed that he wanted to take things further, and she savored her small victory. The painter who, minutes before, had been giving orders and had seemed so utterly sure of what he wanted, had now gone back to being a man like any other man, full of insecurity when confronted by a woman he didn't know. "And what are those books?" She showed them to him. "Farm administration." The man seemed to grow even more insecure. "Are you a sex worker?" He had shown his cards. Was she dressed like a prostitute? Anyway, she needed to gain time. She was watching herself. Dice was beginning to prove an interesting game, and she had absolutely nothing to lose. Is that all men think about? He put the books back in the bag. Sex and farm management. How very dull. What? It was suddenly her turn to feel put on the spot. How dare he speak ill of her profession? He still didn't know exactly what she did, though. He was just trying out a hunch, but she had to give him an answer. "Well, I can't think of anything duller than painting, a static thing, a movement frozen in time, a photograph that is never faithful to the original. A dead thing that is no longer of any interest to anyone, apart from painters, who are people who think they're important and cultivated, but who haven't evolved with the rest of the world. Have you ever heard of Joan Miro? Well, I hadn't until an Arab in a restaurant mentioned the name, but knowing the name didn't change anything in my life." She wondered if she had gone too far, but then the drinks arrived and the conversation was interrupted. They sat saying nothing for a while. Maria thought it was probably time to leave, and perhaps Ralph Hart thought the same. But before them stood those envo glasses full of that disgusting drink, and that was a reason for them to continue sitting there together. Why the book on farm management? What do you mean? I've been to Rue de Berne. Myman, you said you worked in a nightclub. I remembered that I'd seen you before in that very expensive place. I didn't think of it while I was painting, though, your light was so strong. Maria felt the floor beneath her feet give way. For the first time, she felt ashamed of what she did, even though she had no reason to. She was working to keep herself and her family. He was the one who should feel ashamed of going to Rue de Berne. All the possible charm of that meeting had suddenly vanished. Listen, Mr. Hart, I may be a Brazilian, but I've lived in Switzerland for 9 months now. I've learned that the reason the Swiss are so discreet is because they live in a very small country where almost everyone knows everyone else, as we have just discovered, which is why no one ever asks what other people do. Your remark was both inappropriate and very rude, but if your aim was to humiliate me in order to make yourself feel better, you're wasting your time. Thanks for the anisette, which is disgusting, by the way, but which I will drink to the last drop. I will then smoke a cigarette, and, finally, I'll get up and leave. But you can leave right now, if you want. We can't have famous painters sitting at the same table as a prostitute. Because that's what I am, you see. A prostitute. I am a prostitute through and through, from head to toe, and I don't care who knows. That's my one great virtue. I refuse to deceive myself or you. Because it's not worth it. You don't merit a lie. Imagine if that famous chemist over there were to find out what I am. She began to speak more loudly. Yes, I'm a prostitute. And do you know what? It's set me free, knowing that I be leaving this god-awful place in exactly 90 days' time, with loads of money, far better educated, capable of choosing a good bottle of wine, with my handbag stuffed with photographs of the snow, and knowing all there is to know about men. The waitress was listening, horrified. The chemist seemed not to notice. Perhaps it was just the alcohol talking, or the feeling that soon she would once more be a woman from the interior of Brazil, or perhaps it was the sheer joy of being able to say what she did and to laugh at the shocked reactions, the critical looks, the scandalous gestures. Do you understand, Mr. Hart? I am a prostitute through and through, from head to toe, and that's my one great quality, my virtue. He said nothing. He didn't even move. Maria felt her confidence returning. And you, sir, are a painter with no understanding of your models. Perhaps the chemist sitting over there, dozing, lost to the world, is really a railway worker. Perhaps none of the other people in your painting are what they seem. I can't understand otherwise how you could possibly say that you could see a special lie in a woman who, as you discovered while you were painting, I asked nothing but these last words were spoken very slowly and loudly. The chemist woke up and the waitress brought the bill. This has nothing to do with you as prostitute, but with you as woman. Ralph ignored the proffered bill and replied equally slowly, but quietly. You have a glow about you. The light that comes from sheer willpower, the light of someone who has made important sacrifices in the name of things she thinks are important. It's in your eyes, the light is in your eyes. Maria felt disarmed. He had not taken up her challenge. She had wanted to believe that he was simply trying to pick her up. She was not allowed to think, at least not for the next 90 days, that there were interesting men on the face of the earth. You see that glass of anisette before you, he went on. Now, you just see the anisette. I, on the other hand, because I need to bainside everything I do, see the plant it came from, the storms the plant endured, the hand that picked the grain, the voyage by ship from another land, the smells and colors with which the plant allowed itself to be imbued before it was placed in the alcohol. If I were to paint the eyes seen, I would paint all those things, even though, when you saw the painting, you would think you were looking at a simple glass of anisette. In just the same way, while you were gazing out at the street and thinking, because I know you were about the road to Santiago, I painted your childhood, your adolescence, your lost, broken dreams, your dreams for the future, and your will, which is what most intrigues me. When you saw your portrait, Maria put up her guard, knowing that it would be very difficult to lower it again later on. I saw that light even though all that was before me was a woman who looked like you. Again that constrained silence. Anuria looked at her watch. I have to go in a moment. Why did you say that sex is boring? You should know that better than me. I know because it's my job. I do the same thing every day. But you're a young man of 30. 29. Young, attractive, famous, who should be interested in things like that, and who shouldn't have to go to Rue de Berne looking for company. Well, I did. I went to bed with a few of your colleagues, but not because I had any problem finding female company. The problem lies with me. Maria felt a pang of jealousy, and was terrified. She really must leave. It was my last try. I've given up now, said Ralph, starting to pick up the painting materials scattered on the floor. Have you got some physical problem? No, I'm just not interested. This wasn't possible. Pay the bill and let's go for a walk. I think a lot of people feel the same, but no one ever says so. It's good to talk to someone so honest. They set off along the road to Santiago, which first climbed and then descended down to the river, then to the lake, then onto the mountains, to end in some distant place in Spain. They passed people going back to work after lunch, mothers with their prams, tourists taking photographs of the splendid fountain in the middle of the lake, Muslim women in their headscarves, boys and girls out jogging, all of them pilgrims in search of that mythological city, Santiago de Compostela, which might not even exist, which might be a legend in which people need to believe in order to give meaning to their lives. Along this road walked by so many people, over so many years, went that man with long hair, carrying a heavy bag full of brushes, paints, canvas, and pencils, and that woman, slightly younger, with her bag full of books about farm management. It did not occur to either of them to ask why they were making that pilgrimage together. It was the most natural thing in the world. He knew everything about her, although she knew nothing about him, which is why she decided to ask, now that her policy was always to ask. At first, he reacted shyly, but she knew how to wheedle information out of men, and he ended up telling her that he had been married twice, a record for a 29-year-old, had traveled widely, met kings and queens and famous actors, been to unforgettable parties. He had been born in Geneva, but had lived in Madrid, Amsterdam, New York, and in a city in the south of France, called Tarbes, which wasn't on any of the usual tourist circuits, but which he loved because it was so close to the mountains and because its inhabitants were so warm. 11 minutes hearted. He had discovered as an artist when he was only 20, when an important art dealer happened to visit a Japanese restaurant in Geneva decorated with his work. He had earned a lot of money, he was young and healthy, he could do anything, go anywhere, meet anyone he liked, he had known all the pleasures a man could know, he did what he most enjoyed doing, and yet, despite everything, fame, money, women, travel, he was unhappy, and had only one joy in his life, his work. Were you very hurt by women? She asked, realizing at once what an idiotic question it was, straight out of some manual entitled Everything Women Should Know If They Want to Get Their Man. No, they never hurt me. I was very happy in both my marriages. I was unfaithful and so were they, just like any other normal couple. Then, after a while, I simply lost interest in sex. I still felt love, still needed company, but sex. But why are we talking about sex? Because, as you yourself said, I'm a prostitute. My life isn't very interesting really. I'm an artist who found success very young, which is rare, and even rarer in the world of painting. I could paint anything now and it would be worth a fortune, which, of course, infuriates the critics because they think they are the only ones who know about art. Other people think T've got all the answers, and the less I say, the more intelligent they think I am. He went on talking his life, how every week he was invited to something somewhere in the world. He had an agent who lived in Barcelona. Did she know where that was? Yes, Maria knew, it was in Spain. This agent dealt with everything to do with money, invitations, exhibitions, but never pressured him to do anything he didn't want to do. Now that, after years of work, there was a steady demand for his paintings. "Do you find my story interesting?" he asked, and his voice betrayed a touch of insecurity. "It's certainly an unusual one. Lots of people would like to be in your shoes." Ralph wanted to know about Maria. "Well, there are three of me, really, depending on who I'm with. There's the innocent girl, who gazes admiringly at the man, pretending to be impressed by his tales of power and glory. Then there's the femme fatale, who pounces on the most insecure and, by doing so, takes control of the situation and relieves them of responsibility, because then they don't have to worry about anything. And, finally, there's the understanding mother, who looks after those in need of advice and who listens with an all-comprehending air to stories that go in one ear and out the other. Which of the three would you like to meet?" "You." Maria told him everything, because she needed to. It was the first time she had done so since she left Brazil. She realized that, despite her somewhat unconventional job, nothing very exciting had happened apart from that week in Rio and her first month in Switzerland. Otherwise, it had been home, work, and nothing else. When she finished speaking, they were sitting in another bar, this time on the other side of the city, far from the road to Santiago, each of them thinking about what fate had reserved for the other. "Did I leave anything out?" she asked. How to say goodbye? Yes, it had not been an afternoon like any other. She felt tense and anxious, for she had opened a door which she didn't know how to close. "When can I see the whole painting?" Ralph gave her the card of his agent in Barcelona. "Phone her in about 6 months' time, if you're still in Europe. The Faces of Geneva, Famous People and Anonymous People. It will be exhibited for the first time in a gallery in Berlin. Then it will tour Europe." Maria remembered her calendar, the 90 days that remained, and the dangers posed by any relationship, any bond. She thought, what is more important in life? Living or pretending to live? Should I take a risk and say that this has been the loveliest afternoon I've spent in all the time I've been here? Should I thank him for listening to me without criticism and without comment? Or should I simply don the armor of the woman with willpower, with the special light, and leave without saying anything? While they were walking along the road to Santiago and while she was listening to herself telling him about her life, she had been a happy woman. She could content herself with that, it was enough of a gift from life. "I'll come and see you," said Ralph Hart. "No, don't. I'll be going back to Brazil soon. We have nothing more to give each other. I'll come and see you as a client. That would be humiliating for me. I'll come and see you so that you can save me." He had made that comment early on, about his lack of interest in sex. She wanted to tell him that she felt the same, but she stopped herself. She had said no too many times, it would be best to say nothing. How pathetic. There she was with the little boy again, only he wasn't asking her for a pencil now, just a little company. She looked at her past, and, for the first time, she forgave herself. It hadn't her fault, but the fault of that insecure little boy, who had given up after the first attempt. They were children and that's how children are. Neither she nor the boy had been in the wrong, and that gave her a great sense of relief, made her feel better. She hadn't betrayed the first opportunity that life had presented her with. We all do the same dying, it's part of the initiation of every human being in search of his or her other half. These things happen. Now, though, the situation was different. However convincing her reasons, I'm going back to Brazil, I work in a nightclub, we hardly know each other, I'm not interested in sex, I don't want anything to do with love, I need to learn how to manage a farm, I don't understand painting, we live in different worlds. Life had thrown down a challenge. She wasn't a child anymore, she had to choose. She preferred to say nothing. She shook his hand, as was the custom there, and went home. If he was the man she wanted him to be, he would not be intimidated by her silence. Extract from Maria's diary, written that same day. Today, while we were walking around the lake, along that strange road to Santiago, the man who was with me, a painter, with a life entirely different from mine, threw a pebble into the water. Small circles appeared where the pebble fell, which grew and grew until they touched a duck that happened to be passing and which had nothing to do with the pebble. Instead of being afraid of that unexpected wave, he decided to play with it. Some hours before that scene, I went into a cafe, heard a voice, and it was as if God had thrown a pebble into that place. The waves of energy touched both me and a man sitting in a corner painting a portrait. He felt the vibrations of that pebble, and so did I. So what now? The painter knows when he has found a model. The musician knows when his instrument is well tuned. Here, in my diary, I am aware that there are certain phrases which are not written by me, but by a woman full of light. I am that woman, though I refuse to accept it. I could carry on like this, but I could also, like the duck on the lake, have fun, and take pleasure in that sudden ripple that set the water rocking. There is a name for that pebble: passion. It can be used to describe the beauty of an earth-shaking meeting between two people, but it isn't just that. It's there in the excitement of the unexpected, in the desire to do something with real fervor, in the certainty that one is going to realize a dream. Passion sends us signals that guide us through our lives, and it's up to me to interpret those signs. I would like to believe that I'm in love with someone I don't know and who didn't figure in my plans at all. All these months of self-control, of denying love, have had exactly the opposite result. I have let myself be swept away by the first person to treat me a little differently. It's just as well I don't have his phone number, that I don't know where he lives, that way I can lose him without having to blame myself for another missed opportunity. And if that is what happens, if I have already lost him, I will at least have gained one very happy day in my life. Considering the way the world is, one happy day is almost a miracle. When she arrived at the Copacabana that night, he was there, waiting for her. He was the only customer. Milan, who had been following her life with some interest, saw that she had lost the battle. "Would you like a drink?" the man asked. "I have to work. I can't risk losing my job. I'm here as a customer." Making a professional proposition. This man, who had seemed so sure of himself that afternoon in the cafe, who wielded a paintbrush with such skill, met important people, had an agent in Barcelona and doubtless earned a lot of money, was now revealing his fragility. He had entered a world he should not have entered. He was no longer in a romantic cafe on the road to Santiago. The charm of the afternoon vanished. "So, would you like a drink?" "I will another time. I have clients waiting for me tonight." Milan overheard these last words. He was wrong. She had not allowed herself to be caught in the trap of promises of love. He nevertheless wondered, at the end of a rather slack night, why she had preferred the company of an old man, a dull accountant and an insurance salesman. Oh, well, it was her problem. As long as she paid her commission, it wasn't up to him to decide who she should or shouldn't go to bed with. From Maria's diary, after that night with the old man, the accountant, and the insurance salesman, what does this painter want of me? Doesn't he realize that we are from different countries, cultures, and sexes? Does he think I know more pleasure than he does and wants to learn something from me? Why didn't he say anything else to me, apart from, "I'm here as a customer"? It would have been so easy for him to say, "I missed you" or "really enjoyed the afternoon we spent together." I would respond in the same way, "I'm a professional," but he should understand my insecurities, because I'm a woman, I'm fragile, and when I'm in that place, I'm a different person. He's a man. He's an artist. He should know that the great aim of every human being is to understand the meaning of total love. Love is not to be found in someone else, but in ourselves. We simply awaken it. But in order to do that, we need the other person. The universe only makes sense when we have someone to share our feelings with. He says he's tired of sex. So am I, and yet neither of us really knows what that means. We are allowing one of the most important things in life to die. He should have saved me, I should have saved him, but he left me no choice. She was terrified. She was beginning to realize that after long months of self-control, the pressure, the earthquake, the volcano of her soul was showing signs that it was about to erupt, and the moment that this happened, she would have no way of controlling her feelings. Who was Di's wretched painter? who might well be lying about his life and with whom she had spent only a few hours, who had not touched her or tried to seduce her. Could there be anything worse? Why were alarm bells ringing in her heart? Because she sensed that the same thing was happening to him, but no, she must be wrong. Ralph's heart just wanted to find a woman capable of awakening in him the fire that had almost burned out. He wanted to make her into some kind of personal sex goddess, with her special light. He was being honest about that, who would take him by the hand and show him the road back to life. He couldn't imagine that Maria felt the same indifference, that she had her own problems. Even after so many men, she had still never achieved orgasm when having ordinary penetrative sex, that she had been making plans that very morning and was organizing a triumphant return to her homeland. Why was she thinking about him? Why was she thinking about someone who, at that very moment, might be painting another woman, saying that she had a special light, that she could be his sex goddess? I'm thinking about him because I was able to talk to him. How ridiculous. Did she think about the librarian? No. Did she think Naya, the Filipino girl, the only one of all the women who worked at the Copacabana with whom she could share some of her feelings? No, she didn't. And they were people with whom she had often talked and with whom she felt comfortable. She tried to divert her attention to thoughts of how hot it was, or to the supermarket she hadn't managed to get to yesterday. She wrote a long letter to her father, full of details about the piece of land she would like to buy, that would make her family happy. She did not give a date for her return, but she hinted that it would be soon. She slept, woke up, slept again and woke again. She realized that the book about farming was fine for Swiss farmers, but completely useless for Brazilians. They were two entirely different worlds. As the afternoon wore on, she noticed that the earthquake, the volcano, the pressure was diminishing. She felt more relaxed. This kind of sudden passion had happened before and had always subsided by the next day. Good, her universe continued unchanged. She had a family who loved her, a man who was waiting for her and who now wrote to her frequently, telling her that the draper's shop was expanding. Even if she decided to get on a plane that night, she had enough money to buy a small farm. She had got through the worst part, the language barrier, the loneliness, the first night in the restaurant with that Arab man, the way in which she had persuaded her soul not to complain what she was doing with her body. She knew what her dream was and she was prepared to do anything to achieve it. And that dream did not, by the way, include men, at least not men who didn't speak her mother tongue or live in her hometown. When the earthquake had subsided, Maria realized she was partly to blame. Why had she not said to him, "I'm lonely, am as miserable as you are, yesterday you saw my light, and it was the first nice, honest thing a man has said to me since I got here." On the radio they were playing an old song, "My loves die even before they're born." Yes, that was what happened with her, that was her fate. From Maria's diary, 2 days after everything had returned to normal, passion makes a person stop eating, sleeping, working, feeling at peace. A lot of people are frightened because, when it appears, it demolishes all the old things it finds in its path. No one wants their life thrown into chaos. That is why a lot of people keep that threat under control, and are somehow capable of sustaining a house or a structure that is already rotten. They are the engineers of the superseded. Other people think exactly the opposite. They surrender themselves without a second thought, hoping to find in passion the solutions to all their problems. They make the other person responsible for their happiness and blame them for their possible unhappiness. They are either euphoric because something marvelous has happened or depressed because something unexpected has just ruined everything. Keeping passion at bay or surrendering blindly to it, which of these two attitudes is the least destructive? I don't know. On the third day, as if risen from the dead, Ralph Hart returned, almost too late, for Maria was already talking to another customer. When she saw him, though, she politely told the other man that she didn't want to dance, that she was waiting for someone else. Only then did she realize that she had spent the last 3 days waiting for him. And at that moment, she accepted everything that fate had placed in her path. She didn't get angry with herself, she was happy, she could allow herself that luxury, because one day she would leave this city. She knew this love was impossible, and yet, expecting nothing, she could nevertheless have everything she still hoped for from that particular stage in her life. Ralph asked her if she would like a drink, and Maria asked for a fruit juice cocktail. The owner of the bar, pretending that he was washing glasses, stared uncomprehendingly at her. What had made her change her mind? He hoped they wouldn't just sit there drinking, and felt relieved when Ralph asked her to dance. They were following the ritual, there was no reason to feel worried. Maria felt Ralph's hand on her waist, his cheek pressed to hers, and the music, thank God, was too loud for them to talk. One fruit juice cocktail wasn't enough to give her courage, and the few words they had exchanged had been very formal. Now it was just a question of time. Would they go to a hotel? Would they make love? It shouldn't be difficult, since he had already said that he wasn't interested in sex. It would just be a matter of going through the motions. On the other hand, that lack of interest would help to kill off any vestige of potential passion. She didn't know now why she had put herself through such torment after their first meeting. Tonight she would be the understanding mother. Ralph Hart was just another desperate man, like millions of others. If she played her role well, if she managed to follow the rules she had laid down for herself since she began working at the Copacabana, there was no reason to worry. It was very dangerous, though, having that man so near, now that she could smell him and she liked the way he smelled, now that she could feel his touch, and she liked his touch, now that she realized she had been waiting for him, she did not like that. Within 45 minutes they had fulfilled all the rules, and the man went over to the owner of the bar and said, "I'm going to spend the rest of the night with her. I'll pay you as if I were 3 clients." The owner shrugged and thought again that the Brazilian girl would end up falling into the trap of love. Maria, for her part, was surprised. She hadn't realized that Ralph Hart knew the rules so well. "Let's go back to my house." Perhaps that was the best thing to do, she thought. Although it went against all of Milan's advice, she decided, in this case, to make an exception. Apart from finding out once and for all whether or not he was married, she would also find out how famous painters live, and one day she would be able to write an article for her local newspaper, so that everyone would know that, during her time in Europe, she had moved in intellectual and artistic circles. What an absurd excuse, she thought. Half an hour later, they arrived at a small village near Geneva, called Coloni. There was a church, a bakery, a town hall, everything in its proper place. And he really did live in a 2-story house, not an apartment. First reaction, he really must be rich. Second reaction, if he were married, he wouldn't dare to do this, because they would be bound to be seen by someone. So, he was rich and single. They went into a hall from which a staircase ascended to the 2nd floor, but they went straight ahead to the 2 rooms at the back that looked onto the garden. There was a dining table in one of the rooms, and the walls were crowded with paintings. In the other room were sofas and chairs, packed bookshelves, overflowing ashtrays, and dirty glasses that had clearly been there for a long time. "Would you like a coffee?" Maria shook her head. No, she wouldn't. "You can't treat me differently just yet. I'm confronting my own demons, doing exactly the opposite of what I promised myself I would do. But let's take things slowly. Tonight I'll play the part of prostitute or friend or understanding mother, even though in my soul I am a daughter in need of affection. When it's all over, then you can make me a coffee. At the bottom of the garden is my studio, my soul. Here, amongst all these paintings and books, is my brain, what I think." Maria thought of her apartment. She had no garden at the back. She did not even have any books, apart from those she borrowed from the library, since there was no point in spending money on something she could get for free. There were no paintings either, apart from a poster for the Shanghai Acrobatic Circus, which she dreamed of going to one day. Ralph picked up a bottle of whiskey and offered her a glass. "No, thank you." He poured himself a drink and swallowed it down in one, without ice, without time to savor it. He started talking about intelligent things, but, however interesting the conversation, she knew that he too was afraid of what was going to happen, now that they were alone. Maria had regained control of the situation. Ralph poured himself another whiskey and, as if he were making some utterly inconsequential remark, he said, "I need you." A pause. A long silence. "Don't help to break that silence, let's see what he does next." "I need you, Maria. Because you have a light, although I don't really think you believe me yet, and think I'm just trying to seduce you with my words. Don't ask me, why me? What's so special about me? There isn't anything special about you, at least, nothing I can put my finger on. And here's the mystery of life, I can't think of anything else." "I wasn't going to ask you," she lied. "If I were looking for an explanation, I would say, the woman in front of me has managed to overcome suffering and to transform it into something positive, something creative, but that doesn't explain everything." It was becoming difficult to escape. He went on, "And what about me? I have my creativity, I have my paintings, which are sought after by galleries all over the world, I have realized my dream, my village thinks of me as a beloved son, my ex-wives never ask me for alimony or anything like that, I have good health, reasonable looks, everything a man could want, and yet here I am saying to a woman I met in a cafe and with whom I have spent one afternoon, I need you. Do you know what loneliness I do? But you don't know what loneliness is like when you have the chance to be with other people all the time, when you get invitations every night to parties, cocktail parties, opening nights at the theater, when women are always ringing you up, women who love your work, who say how much they would like to have supper with you, they're beautiful, intelligent, educated women. But something pushes you away and says, don't go. You won't enjoy yourself. You'll spend the whole night trying to impress them and squander your energies proving to yourself how you can charm the whole world. So I stay at home, go into my studio and try to find the light I saw in you, and I can only see that light when I'm working. What can I give you that you don't already have?" she asked, feeling slightly humiliated by that remark about other women, but remembering that he had, after all, paid to have her at his side. He drank a third glass of whiskey. Maria accompanied him in her imagination, the alcohol burning his throat and his stomach, entering his bloodstream and filling him with courage, and she too began to feel drunk, even though she hadn't touched a drop. When Ralph spoke again, his voice sounded steadier. "I can't buy your love, but you did tell me that you knew everything sex. Teach me, then. Or teach me something about Brazil. Anything, just as long as I can be with you." "What next?" "I only know 2 places in my 0 country, the town I was born in and Rio de Janeiro. As for sex, I don't think I can teach you anything. I'm nearly 23, you're about 6 years older, but I know you've lived life very intensely. I know men who pay me to do what they want, not what I want. I've done everything a man could dream of doing with 1, 5, even 3 women at the same time. And I don't think I learned very much." Silence again, except that this time it was Maria's turn to speak. And he did not help her, just as she had not helped him before. "Do you want me as a professional? I want you however you want to be wanted." No, he couldn't have said that, because that was precisely what she had wanted to hear. The earthquake, the volcano, the storm returned. It was going to be impossible to escape her own trap. She would lose this man without ever really having him. "You know what I mean, Maria. Teach me. Perhaps that will save me, perhaps it will save you and bring us both back to life. You're right, I am only 6 years older than you, and yet I've lived enough for several lives. Our experiences have been entirely different, but we are both desperate people, the only thing that brings us any peace is being together." Why was he saying these things? It wasn't possible, and yet it was true. They had only met once before and yet they already needed each other. Imagine what would happen if they continued seeing each other. It would be disastrous. Maria was an intelligent woman, with many months behind her now of reading and of observing humankind. She had an aim in life, but she also had a soul, which she needed to know in order to discover her light. She was becoming tired of being who she was, and although her imminent return to Brazil was an interesting challenge, she had not yet learned all she could. Ralph Hart was a man who had accepted challenges and had learned everything, and now he was asking this woman, this prostitute, this understanding mother, to save him. How absurd. Other men had behaved like this with her. Many of them had been unable to have an erection, others had wanted to be treated like children, others had said that they would like her to be their wife because it excited them to know that she had had so many lovers. Although she had still not met any of the special clients, she had already discovered the vast universe of fantasies that fills the human soul. But they were all used to their worlds and none of them had said to her, "Take me away from here." On the contrary, they wanted to take Maria with them, and even though those many men had always left her with money, but drained of energy, she must have learned something. If one of them had really been looking for love, and if sex really was only part of that search, how would she like to be treated? What did she think should happen on a first meeting? What would she really like to happen? "I'd like a gift," said Maria. Ralph Hart didn't understand. A gift? He had already paid for that night in advance, while they were in the taxi, because he knew the ritual. What did she mean? Maria had suddenly realized that she knew, at that moment, what a man and a woman needed to feel. She took his hand and led him into one of the sitting rooms. "We won't go up to the bedroom," she said. She turned out almost all the lights, sat down on the carpet and asked him to sit down opposite her. She noticed that there was a fire in the room. "Light the fire." "But it's summer." "Light the fire. You asked me to guide our steps tonight and that's what I'm doing." She gave him a steady look, hoping that he would again see her light. He obviously did, because he went out into the garden, collected some wood still wet with rain, and picked up some old newspapers so that the fire would dry the wood and get it to burn. He went into the kitchen to fetch more whiskey, but Maria called him back. "Did you ask me what I wanted?" "No, I didn't." "Well, the person you're with has to exist too. Think of her. Think if she wants whiskey or gin or coffee. Ask her what she wants. What would you like to drink?" "Wine." "And why'd he like you to keep me company?" He put down the whiskey bottle and returned with a bottle of wine. By this time, the fire was already beginning to burn. Maria turned out the few remaining lights, so that the flames were the only illumination in the room. She behaved as if she had always known that this was the first step, recognizing the other person and knowing that he or she was there. She opened her handbag and found inside a pen she had bought in a supermarket. "Anything would do. This is for you. I bought it so that I could note down some ideas about farm management. I used it for 2 days, I worked until I was too tired to work anymore. It contains some of my sweat, some of my concentration and my willpower, and I'm giving it to you now." She placed the pen gently in his hand. "Instead of buying something that you would like to have, I'm giving you something that is mine, truly mine. A gift. A sign of respect for the person before me, asking him to understand how important it is to be by his side. Now he has a small part of me with him, which I gave him with my free, spontaneous will." Ralph got up, went over to a shelf and returned, carrying something. He held it out to Maria. "This is a carriage belonging to an electric train set I had when I was a child. I wasn't allowed to play with it on my MVN, because my father said it had been imported from the United States and was very expensive. So I had to wait until he felt like setting up the train in the living room, but he spent most Sundays listening to opera. That's why the train survived my childhood, but never gave me any happiness. I've still got all the track, the engine, the houses, even the manual, because I had a train that wasn't mine and with which I never played. I wish RD destroyed it along with all the other toys I was given and which RVE since forgotten all about, because that passion for destruction is part of how a child discovers the world. But this pristine train set always reminds me of a part of my childhood that I never lived, because it was too precious and it meant too much work for my father. Or perhaps it was just that whenever he set the train up, he was afraid he might show his love for me." Maria began staring into the fire. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the wine or the cozy atmosphere. It was that exchange of gifts Ralph turned to the fire too. They said nothing, listening to the crackle of the flames. They drank their wine, as if it didn't matter that they said nothing, did nothing. They were just there, together, staring in the same direction. "I have a lot of pristine train sets in my life too," said Maria, after a while. "One of them is my heart. And I only played with it when the world set out the tracks, and then it wasn't always the right moment." "But you loved." "Oh, yes, I loved very deeply. I loved so deeply that when my love asked me for a gift, I took fright and fled." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. I'm teaching you because I've discovered something I didn't know before. The giving of gifts. Giving something of one's own. Giving something important rather than asking. You have my treasure, the pen with which I wrote down some of my dreams. I have your treasure, the carriage of a train, part of your childhood that you did not live. I carry with me part of your past, and you carry with you a little of my present. Isn't that lovely?" She said all the eyes without blinking, and without surprise, as if she had known for ages that this was the best and only way to behave. She got lightly to her feet, took her jacket from the coat rack and kissed Ralph on the cheek. Ralph's heart did not make any move to get up, hypnotized by the fire, perhaps thinking about his father. "I never understood why I kept that carriage. Now I do. It was in order to give it to you one night before an open fire. Now the house feels lighter." He said that the next day he would give the rest of the tracks, engines, smoke pills, to some children's home. "It could be a rarity, of a kind that isn't made anymore, it could be worth a lot of money," said Maria, but immediately regretted her words. That wasn't what mattered, the point was to free yourself from something that cost your heart even more. Before she said anything else that did not quite chime with the moment, she again kissed him on the cheek and walked to the front door. He was still gazing into the fire, and she had to ask him softly if he would open the door for her. Ralph got up, and she explained that, although she was glad to see him staring into the fire, Brazilians have a strange superstition: when you visit someone for the first time, you must not the one to open the door when you leave, because if you do, you will never return to that house. "And I want to come back. Although we didn't take our clothes off and I didn't come inside you, or even touch you, we've made love." She laughed. He offered to take her home, but she refused. "I'll come and see you tomorrow, then, at the Copacabana." "No, don't. Wait a week. I've learned that waiting is the most difficult bit, and I want to get used to the feeling, knowing that you're with me, even when you're not by my side." She walked back through the cold and the dark, as she had so many times before in Geneva. Normally, these walks were associated with sadness, loneliness, the desire to go back to Brazil, financial calculations, timetables, nostalgia for the language she hadn't spoken freely for ages. Now, though, she was walking in order to find herself, to find that woman who had sat with a man by a fire for 40 minutes and who was full of light, wisdom, experience, and charm. She had seen that woman's face a long time ago, when she was walking by the lakeside wondering whether or not she should devote herself to a life that wasn't hers. On that afternoon, the woman had a terribly sad smile on her face. She had seen her for a second time on that folded canvas, and now she was with her again. She only caught a taxi after she had walked quite a way, when the magic presence had gone, leaving her alone again, as usual. It was best not to think too much about it all, so as not to spoil it, so as not to let the beauty of what she had just experienced be replaced by anxiety. If that other Maria really existed, she would return when the moment was right. An extract from the diary Maria W. wrote on the night she was given the train carriage: "IJ profound desire, true desire is the desire to be close to someone. From that point onwards, things change, the man and the woman come into play, but what one happens before, the attraction that brought them together, is impossible to explain. It is untouched desire in its purest state. When desire is still in this pure state, the man and the woman fall in love with life. They live each moment reverently, consciously, always ready to celebrate the next blessing. When people feel like this, they are not in a hurry, they do not precipitate events with unthinking actions. They know that the inevitable will happen, that what is real always finds a way of revealing itself. When the moment comes, they do not hesitate, they do not miss an opportunity, they do not let slip a single magic moment, because they respect the importance of each second. If in the days that followed, Maria found herself once more caught in the trap she had tried so hard to avoid, but she felt neither sad nor concerned. On the contrary, now that she had nothing to lose, she was free. She knew that, however romantic the situation, one day, Ralph Hart would realize that she was just a prostitute, while he was a respected artist, that she lived in a far-off country that was in a state of permanent crisis, while he lived in paradise, with his life organized and protected from birth. He had received his education in the best schools, museums, and art galleries of the world, while she had barely finished secondary school. Dreams like theirs never lasted long, and Maria had enough experience of life to know that reality usually chose not to fit in with her dreams. And that was now her great joy, to say to reality that she didn't need it, that she was no longer dependent on what happened in order to be happy. God, I'm such a romantic. During the week, she tried to think of something that would make Ralph Hart happy, for he had restored to her a dignity and a light that she thought were lost forever. But the only way she had of repaying him was with the thing he thought was her speciality, sex. Since there was little to inspire her in the routine at the Copacabana, she decided to look elsewhere. She again went to see a few porn movies, and again found nothing of interest in them, apart, perhaps, from the varying number of people involved. When films proved of no help, she decided, for the first time since she had arrived in Geneva, to buy some books, although she still didn't see the point in cluttering up her apartment with something which, once read, had no further use. She went to the bookshop she had seen when she and Ralph had walked down the road to Santiago, and asked if they had any books about sex. "Oh, loads," said the shop assistant. "In fact, it seems to be all people care about. There's a special section devoted to the subject, but in just about every other novel you can see around you there's always at least one sex scene. Whether it's hidden away in pretty little love stories or discussed in serious tomes on human behavior, it appears to be all anyone thinks." Maria, with all her experience, knew that the woman was wrong. People wanted to think like that. They thought sex was everyone else's sole concern. They went on diets, wore wigs, spent hours at the hairdresser's or at the gym, put on sexy clothes, all in an attempt to awaken the necessary spark. And what happened? When the moment came to go to bed with someone, 11 minutes later it was all over. There was no creativity involved, nothing that would lift them up to paradise. The fire provoked by the spark soon burned out. But there was no point arguing with the young blonde woman, who believed that the world could be explained in books. She asked to be directed to the special section, and there she found various books about gay men, lesbians, nuns revealing scandals in the church, illustrated showing Oriental